Okay. The one yes. Got it.
You're welcome to sit in for me.
No, I'll be out of your way shortly, I promise.
Is this some ritual that I missed?
One of the reasons I hate doing clap test is late.
You can do the same thing. Like, it's like, what are you doing?
I know. At one event, everybody in the audience started clapping with me. It was crazy. How are you doing, Marie?
Good, how are you?
Good. We have video, yes.
Has something
It should be good.
today, doesn't he?
I'm not actually sure.
Oh, okay.
He has been buzzing all over the place.
It's been a very busy time, yeah.
I saw your email.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I
good.
didn't actually get to look at it, but
I figured that was the case.
you probably can put it out this afternoon or
Okay.
tomorrow morning.
Okay, if you have any thoughts or comments,
Yeah.
let me know.
Yeah.
You do that so well.
I know, this is so crazy.
Can we join you?
No.
Only one at a time. Just do you have any idea why he's doing that?
Sound.
Yes, but what about sound?
Well, I assume they're checking to make sure there aren't these sharp pops that you get sometimes.
No, it's actually called plug test to ensure that we marry up the audio and the video signals properly.
Oh,
It's
so it's not just audio, it's going to be video as well.
That's our hope. That was the plan,
Uh-huh.
and they're having some issues. There's a little gremlin that runs around and kind of messes things up. But yeah, in case you don't know, here's your useless trivia for the day. That audio and video signals are separate.
Yeah.
And then
Good morning. Thank you all for coming to our event, Engaging North Korea Through Media, Opportunity and Challenges. It's a pleasure for VOA Korean Service to host this forum. We would like to thank all of our distinguished speakers and our guests for coming down here this morning. Hello, my name is Eun Cho. I'm a reporter with the VOA Korean Service, and I'm also host of VOA Korean Service's weekly discussion show focused solely on North Korea called Washington Talk. I'm going to introduce everybody first and then make a short opening remark and go to the questions. Today we have a great panel that will explore this issue from different angles, and I will make this brief because you have a longer version that we have handed out to you. I will start from the other hand. Mr. Dong-hyuk Lee is the chief of the VOA Korean Service, and since joining VOA, Mr. Lee transformed the VOA Korean Service into a leading outlet for North Korean news, original and breaking, and he's also spearheaded efforts to start a new TV team last year. And next to Mr. Dong-hyuk Lee is Ms. Kang In-sun. She's the Washington bureau chief at the Joseon-ilbo. She's a former member of the editorial board there and was embedded as a war reporter during the war in Iraq in 2003. And at the center is, as we all know, is Ambassador Robert King, is a senior advisor at the CSIS Korea chair. Ambassador King served as special envoy for North Korea human rights issues at the U.S. Department of State from 2009 to 2017. And earlier, Dr. King was staff director of the House Foreign Affairs Committee under Chairman Tom Lantos. And also CSIS, Ms. Marie Dumont is Associate Director and Associate Fellow in the Office of the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Dumont is in charge of CSIS public opinion surveys inside North Korea, which is called A View Inside North Korea. And right next to me is Ms. Jin Lee, the Director of Korea Center Program at the Wilson Center. Ms. Lee is a veteran foreign correspondent and is AP's first Pyongyang bureau chief, and she was first American reporter granted extensive access on the ground in North Korea. Welcome to all of you. Let's give them a hand. Now we're just 1 week away from the historic summit between President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The U.S. government is promising economic prosperity and security in exchange for quick denuclearization. Now, amid a flurry of diplomatic activities, there's a question whether North Korea will come out of isolation, engage more with the international world, and are international media ready for this change in North Korea? And we have a panel, great panel here, who will explore this issue from many different angles here today. And today we have, I divided this forum into 3 parts. First, I will ask questions to each panelist, and then we will have an open discussion among the panelists, and then I will open to the floor to receive your questions. Let me move on here. Now, why don't I start with Ambassador Robert King. Ambassador, information control in North Korea speaks to the dire human rights situation in North Korea, and I believe information control was also part of your portfolio as an envoy, right? And I want to ask you, the U.S. government supports not only BBG, but also South Korean broadcasters broadcasting into North Korea. So what is U.S. government efforts in putting information into North Korea?
The U.S. government has a number of programs and efforts that have been focused on getting information into North Korea. The backbone of our efforts is the BBG programming, Voice of America, Radio Free Asia. They provide a significant amount of radio broadcasting. They also provide a significant amount of content that is used in other forms, and I think it's particularly important. And that seems to be the key element there. There are also some funding that's provided by the United States government, democracy funding through the Department of State. This has provided funds for non-government organization, NGO broadcasting, primarily from South Korea. In addition, the U.S. government provides funding to the National Endowment for Democracy, which also provides some support. There's some support for content of broadcasting, some support for the physical process of getting the material on the air and getting it into North Korea. But this, I think, is of the key elements of what the United States does. And what we do, we try to be aware of what else is going on in terms of broadcasting into North Korea. Clearly, the most important and probably the largest component of broadcasting into North Korea, of information into North Korea, is from South Korea. The South Korean government provides some funding. There's radio broadcasting, there's some television broadcasting, and this is a particularly important element that I think is involved there. We try to be aware of what they're doing. We try to make sure the South Korean government is aware of what we're doing so that what we do is complementary. In addition, there are other broadcasting that goes on, other information programs that are out there. The BBC started a Korean service recently, and there's been some modest amount of broadcasting that the BBC brings. My sense is the more that's out there, the better. It's nice to have options, it's nice to have variety, and when you're trying to get information into a country that's starved for information, more is good. And so I think that's been helpful. In terms of where we stand right now, as significant changes are beginning to take place in terms of at least the relationships with North Korea and South Korea, between North Korea and the United States possibly, I think it's important to think about where we are on these issues. I don't think that broadcasting information policy has changed just because there are some changes in terms of North Korea's willingness to talk or willingness to engage. My sense is that there is very strong support in the United States Congress for information programming going into North Korea. And I think that the support is there, which means the funding is there, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to continue this effort. My hope is that we'll be able to increase the amount, but that's always more difficult. But I think it's important that we continue that effort. In terms of what's happening in North Korea, my sense is the North Korean government has not changed its attitude towards information, towards the importance of its having a monopoly on information. And I don't see North Korea making any significant changes in terms of its efforts to control broadcasting, to limit what reaches people in North Korea. And as euphoric as some of these events may be, I don't think they necessarily presage any kind of change in terms of treatment of policy. The North Koreans are very sophisticated in terms of their blocking mechanisms, and I think they're going to continue to put resources into that, making it more difficult, making it more complicated for us. On the other hand, I think we've been, in the past, willing to face the challenge of North Korea, and I think we need to continue to do that. In terms of the North Korean people who don't have access to outside information, I think there is strong interest in outside information. Some people are interested in news, some people are interested in fashion, some people are interested in drama. I think that's going to continue. The one thing that I think may be significant is that in times of political change, there is always an increased interest in news and in trying to get information about what's going on. If I can date myself, I began when I finished graduate school at Radio Free Europe, in the days when Radio Free Europe was broadcasting to Central Europe. I was in Munich at the headquarters of Radio Free Europe in December of 1970. Most of you were not even alive at that time. But in December of 1970, there was a sudden, unannounced increase in prices in Poland. Foodstuffs went up, this kind of thing. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to know what was going on. 62 people were killed in riots that took place. A large number of people were injured. Police were called out. Martial law was declared. Radio Free Europe was a major broadcaster to Poland during this time. And during the time of this unrest in December of 1970. Radio Free Europe's listenership in Poland skyrocketed. 80% of people listening regularly to Radio Free Europe to find out what was going on inside their country. Now, I can see this maybe not so dramatic an effect taking place in North Korea as North Koreans become aware of changes that are taking place elsewhere. And they will get, even through their own media, some indications of what's going on, but there will likely be greater interest in terms of what other people are thinking about what is going on. And I see this as a time when the importance of information, when access to information is more important than it's ever been. But I think these are important considerations in terms of where we are and where we're moving. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very extensive. And I will now move on to Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, you've been with VOA for more than a decade, and before that, you've been with RFA for many years as senior editor there. So tell us about U.S. media putting information into North Korea.
Well, I'd like to limit my conversation to what we do as a broadcaster under the BBG programming. There are two broadcasts, basically, VOA Korean and Radio Free Asia Korean. VOA Korean has 7 hours of radio broadcasting every day, and RFA Korean has 6 hours of radio broadcasting every day. VOA is trying to target the North Korean elites with news and information about U.S. Foremost and the world. I mean, we do way more than that, but if I put in one sentence, I think that would be the core sort of a mission of what we do as a VOA Korean. We are using medium wave signals and short wave signals. Both are quite powerful. And we don't have many opportunities, but we do sometimes have a very rare opportunities to send people in North Korea as a part of a tour coverage, or as part of other purposes. And we have some anecdotes from them, and they tell us that the reception is really loud and clear. So I think we are depending on radio for quite a bit for many, many years, and I think it's still very viable and effective delivery means for VOA and RFA Korean. Early last year, we really did something dramatic. It was a brand new effort, and it's a sort of an experimental effort, but still it's a very important first solid step toward exploring potential new platform, and that is the television. We launched the VOA and RFA both launched the video production team. And VOA has launched 7 programs, some documentary programs, feature programs. And then we have a very important 2 news programs. One is Anjung is actually hosting weekly panel discussion, which is quite popular among all the pundits and North Korea experts in this town. Not only that, it is gaining a lot of viewership on YouTube and some other means too. That particular program is on satellite too. So we are making brand new efforts, and I think I'll have some opportunity to touch upon this topic again, but maybe in later discussion. And we are quite hopeful about the potential opportunities in North Korea.
Just a quick follow-up. So what is the value of VOA, and why should North Koreans listen or watch VOA?
Yeah, I'll be brief and quick. I think there are about 6 major players or 7 major players trying to target, trying to serve North Koreans. And obviously, we are one of the major players in the market. We are focusing on, the United States and America in general. With all these developments between, Pyongyang and Seoul, and the renewed diplomacy between Washington and Pyongyang on the nuclear issue, I think give us an opportunity and some type of a potential for North Korea to engage with the world and the U.S. for that matter. And in that process, I think VOA can play a critical role in informing North Korean elites and other people in the country, for that matter, about the U.S. U.S. government policies, and let's say, for example, an ordinary American citizen, how he or she thinks about North Korean, what is going on in the country. So I think we're in the business of informing them, and so that they can make a informed decision about the future of the country and the future relationship with the United States.
And speaking about major players, Ms. In Sang-gang's daily 조선일보 is the largest in South Korea, and she will tell us about South Korean efforts. So since President Moon Jae-in, he came into power a year ago, and since President Moon came into power, how has government support to South Korean broadcasters changed?
I don't think, that much changes after Moon Jae-in has come to office. So maybe let me start with my experience. Actually, while I was in Korea, I knew that there was something going on about this South Korean broadcasting into North Korea, but I have never heard about that. So last night, for this forum, I just chose one of those YouTube things and listened to that, and to my surprise, it was quite funny. There was a lot diverse programs are in that programs, like how to speak Seoulite, like people in Seoul. So all those current affairs, it's news, it's weather and sports, and of course K-pop, and so many things are in that big pool. So I was pretty much impressed by that. So I looked one North Korean refugee who now works for 조선일보. He's a reporter in Korea, in 조선일보. So I called him. So have you ever heard about this while you were in North Korea? And he said, of course, I was addicted to that. So it was kind of eye-opening thing for me. So just tell me about your experience. So what he said was that in North Korea, it's an isolated country, as you know. So there's nothing much you can get from TV or radio in North Korea, which is all state, kind of propaganda type of things. So it was very boring. There's nothing much you can get out of that. But once you started listening to this radio from outside world, he said it was so fun. So you cannot just stop listening to that radio. So wow. So how about, actually he escaped the country 2000. So how about now? Do you think the same thing happened in North Korea now? And he said, of course, it's still there. People still love that one. So what is the means that he could listen, they could listen to all these radio programs? And he said he bought a radio in black market. And these days, they have a better, technically more developed radio now, mostly from China. It's easier for them to get access to that radio programs. So I just checked all the radio stations in Korea, and then KBS has a major force in that area, I think. So they have, we call that 한민족 방송, which is Korean Nation Broadcasting. So I just checked all the programs they are producing these days, and they have do programs like 20 hours a day, and they have 17 producers there, and they are making like 28 programs a week, so which is all different things. So, but there are KBS it's a kind of public type of a thing, and there are other radio stations run by National Intelligence Service and Ministry of Defense. So those are something that you can expect what they are trying to convey. And then the last part is at a private level, which is mostly run by North Korean human rights groups. So they also have a very big impact on the contents and everything. But the major changes they have found these days is that after Inter-Korean Summit on April 27th, actually there was a kind of a tendency that they tried to avoid, severe criticism against, the North Korean regime. But that's more in KBS and which is a state-run media. But the other side of all those North Korean human rights group-based radio station, I think they are not affected by that trend. But when you look at the history of these broadcasting into North Korean, there's a trend in line with the government policy position toward North Korea. So, that's what people have observed, that there's a kind of a similarity in that there. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up, because I wasn't expecting ever since Moon Jae-in president came into power, there isn't much change because there's this reconciliatory move, and people would expect that the South Korean government would kind of want to deter the North Korean broadcasting into North Korea. So why do you think there is no change then?
No, I wouldn't say no change, but it's not like now it's a Moon Jae-in era, so let's just stop something and let's do something new. It's not like that. The changes are just embedded in the new trend. So as I told you, like after inter-Korean talks, it's a little bit different, and then people may feel that kind of changes, but it's not like policy decision type of things. That's what I meant to say.
I see. And right next to me is Ms. Jean Lee. She's also a veteran journalist, and now she's a Korea expert at the Wilson Center. And she was the AP's first Pyongyang bureau chief until 2013. And Chairman Kim Jong-un came to power in 2011, so she was there to see all the transition there. And I want to ask you about the Kim Jong-un regime and its control, information control. Ever since Chairman Kim Jong-un came into power, has the information control got more stronger as opposed to his father Kim Jong-il?
There's so many interesting things that I want to respond to with what you've said, but actually I have seen a significant change in how the regime considers foreign content. This is a regime that has portrayed its leader as somebody who embraces the modern world, embraces science and technology. There's been so much promotion of information technology. The cell phone network, for example, is one thing that I think has had vast impact in terms of how North Koreans can communicate. That said, and I will get into some details about what I've seen on the ground, that said, I have not seen a significant change in terms of the loosening of control over the flow of information. So although North Korea is more open to outside information, they still want to have very tight control over what their people see, read, and hear. And so, but I will talk a little bit about what I'm seeing on the ground. I have to say that they do listen to VOA. Every time I was in North Korea, they mentioned any time I was mentioned in VOA. So it does tell us that the elites, there are certain people who have permission to access the internet or to listen, and their jobs are to listen to VOA and to monitor foreign content, anything that's being written about North Korea. I think it's interesting. When I was opening the AP office inside KCNA, I did ask them, people often ask me, did they censor your work? And I said, well, that was a red line. I told them, you can't see anything. I can't let you see what it is I'm sending out before it goes on the wire. But you're perfectly welcome to Google us afterward. And they did. And I did once ask them to take me to the room where they have internet access so they could see what I was doing. And so there is a room inside KCNA where they can monitor foreign content. And what it reminded me of was years ago I made a trip to Joseonilbo, and there was a room inside Joseonilbo where journalists who had special permission to monitor North Korean content were also in a locked room reading KCNA. So the lack of flow information goes both ways, I think.
I myself never been there.
No, it was very similar. You have to have permission. We have a national security law in South Korea that does prevent us from accessing North Korean media, right? And I did hope that that would change under President Moon. I do hope that we'll have more access to information about North Korea because it does help us understand the country better. Now, I want to talk about the cell phone network. This is such an incredibly powerful tool to have a 3G network in North Korea. The idea that people can pick up a phone, those who can afford it, those who have access to one, can pick up a phone and call somebody in another city and exchange information. At the time when I first got to North Korea, and I've been going there for 10 years, was powerful. They were so used to getting information that the concept of being able to ask for information was very new to them. I think this is a very powerful tool that you're giving the people. That said, it's a divided network. Again, as with everything else in North Korea, as a foreigner, I had the ability to call my colleagues. I could call my sister in Brooklyn. I could call my office in Beijing. I could not call South Korea, and I could not call my North Korean colleagues. The North Koreans, I got them cell phones. I bought them cell phones, but they could not call me. So that division between foreigners and locals still remains. But, so their cell phones, they could subscribe to the party newspaper, Nodong Shimun, and receive updates on their cell phones through their intranet. I could not. I actually tried to subscribe, but I could, through the 3G network, access the newspaper through our World Wide Web. So there is the separation, right? I was able to access the World Wide Web from my cell phone in North Korea. They were able to access their intranet, so vetted by their government. Now, there were a few other things that I saw happen. The introduction of the PC, the tablet PC, which they call the iPad. I had to tell them that not all tablet PCs are made by Apple, as much as you want an Apple iPad. But that device, if any of you have ever used one, is loaded with content. It is also loaded with American content and foreign content that is vetted by the government. I should also mention that during my time there, we saw the introduction of, I should say, the resurrection of an educational channel that showed foreign content 3 times a week. One day it was English language programming, lots of Disney cartoons, and that is actually a powerful, that is the only sanctioned American content that I've seen. And we have seen, some of you may have seen the broadcast of some Disney characters who are prancing around on stage on state TV. So we do see Disney characters quite a bit. That's the only sanctioned American content that I think I've seen. One day a week they have Chinese content, and one day a week they have Russian content. Now, it wasn't unusual for me on a weekend to turn the TV on in Pyongyang and see foreign movies. So I saw everything from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon to Russian soap operas. So just remember that there is some foreign content. It's just that the regime wants to control it. Along with foreign content on devices and TV, these e-libraries that we're seeing opening up at Kim Il-sung University, at the Grand People's Study House, at the new Science and Technology Center that is shaped like an atom. It's amazing what kind of things I've seen students viewing on the computers at those centers, everything from tutorials on how to play golf to cartoons. All of it is foreign content that I've seen, but vetted by the regime. So there is a hunger for foreign content and more of an acceptance by the regime that they can learn from it, but they want to make sure that they have control over it. And I'm just going to, there was one thing that I noticed when I was watching the new educational TV channel, and I'm going to make sure that, I just want to make sure I get this quote right. I did see this quote posted outside the e-library at Kim Il-sung University. So this is a quote from Kim Jong-il, supposedly, reportedly made in 2009. So during this period that I call the succession era, when they were grooming Kim Jong-un and really laying the groundwork for his leadership, keep your feet firmly planted in this land and look out over the world. And I thought that was so interesting. So it's like, telling their students, you need to be aware of what's happening in the rest of the world, but remember your roots. Remember that you are Korean and always choose the Korean way of doing things. But go ahead and learn from the outside world. But they are clearly uncomfortable with giving them complete access. They still want to control it. They still want to make sure that it falls into line with their ideology and the regime's priorities.
Just a quick follow-up. As with many other issues involving North Korea, I see these very conflicting signals from the Kim Jong-un regime. Is that Kim Jong-un wants to develop the economy and do trade with the outside world. At the same time, Kim Jong-un regime is tightly controlling the border. So how are these two factors factoring into the information control?
I think we're going to go into a very tricky period when it comes to economic partnership and engagement, because on the one hand, North Korea wants the investment, but they understand also that opening up opens them up to outside influence, and that is very dangerous. So I think we're going to see, I don't think we're going to see a sort of wide-scale openness. We're going to see them saying, listen, yes, we want your money, but everyone's going to be very careful inside North Korea about the danger the influence from foreign companies or foreign entities is going to put them under. So it's a very tricky, you have to remember that for North Koreans, having any contact with outsiders also puts them at risk, because they have to pay attention to whether it looks as though they've been influenced by foreigners and that their way of thinking may have been converted by these foreigners. So they're always very conscious of it. So I think we need to be aware that this era of openness is largely propaganda, and that when it comes down to the logistics, they're going to be very careful about how much they let in.
Right. And Marie Dumont from CSIS, she's the associate director there, and she's in charge of this public survey inside of North Korea. What they do is they survey the North Koreans still living inside North Korea. And they did an interesting survey last year. It's called Information and Its Consequences in North Korea. So Marie, tell us about this survey. How much foreign information did the North Koreans consume, and what were the consequences?
Yeah, so first, just to give a little more context on the survey, it's a micro survey, so we talked to 36 people. Because access to North Korea is difficult, and because of the safety considerations with talking, sharing opinions and stuff, we used a survey method called a sampling of convenience. So I just want to make sure everyone knows you have to be really careful when you start scaling that up to the whole country. But just speaking about the 36 people we spoke to, about 92% of them, or 33 of them, said that they access foreign media at least once a month. When we looked at whether they were near the border or they were in provinces that were further away, that really didn't matter. Where they were located didn't seem to influence how often they were able to access it. So geography, that said to us, geography wasn't causing a hindrance to the flow of information. They could access it anywhere in the country, and this we know from surveys and testimony from people who have since left North Korea and are living in other countries. When you talk to them, they say people share information through a person-to-person network or in markets, which is a big place where they will get the cell phones or the DVDs or access to radios. So that is throughout the whole, that can be accessed throughout the whole country. While access does seem to be available, and quite a number of people seem to be using it quite frequently, there are significant consequences to accessing outside information that's not allowed. We heard a lot about how they're carefully controlling it. In the 2014, the UN Commission of Inquiry found that there were grave human rights abuses around the control of outside information, and that type of information are things such as South Korean dramas and radio broadcast telephones, not necessarily things you would typically consider as sedacious material, but nonetheless strictly controlled. Some North Korean laws, one for example, it says that if you're found possessing culturally inappropriate content or distributing it, you can receive anywhere between 3 to 15 years in a labor camp. Some other escapees have testified that particularly sensitive information, such as some South Korean dramas or items like the Christian Bible, that can result in a death sentence. And so that doesn't happen for all types of media or for all people, but the consequences for accessing this type of information can be very grave.
And how often did they, how did the foreign media being integrated into their daily lives?
Yeah, so like I said, the majority of them, 92%, accessed at least once a month. 6 of the people that we talked to accessed it every day, which is impressive. I do not access foreign media every day. So this is a big part of their lives. 12 of them said they accessed it at least once a week, and then the 15 remaining said that they had accessed it at least once a month. So something that they are regularly going to. We didn't ask them specifically what type of foreign media they are accessing, so this could be entertainment type things, dramas, TV shows, K-pop, or it could be more informational news or current events, weather reports. So we didn't ask them exactly what. Interestingly, of the ones who had accessed, 32 of them said that they found the information from the outside world that they had accessed to be actually useful for their daily lives. So it wasn't something that they weren't interested in or wasn't something that they found use for, but they actually found the outside information to be quite useful for their daily lives.
All right. I've already gained so much insight listening from these great speakers for the half an hour. Why don't we move on to our second segment, which will be an open discussion. I will give out a question, and then we will have free discussion among the panelists. Just a quick announcement that this program is being live streamed at www.insidevoa.com and is also live on satellite right now. I'll move on to the second segment and give out the first question. So what are the prospects of Kim Jong-un regime opening up more to the outside world after that big event a week later, the meeting between President Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un? Should we start with Jean?
I really hope that as part of this coming out process where he's emerging as he's trying to create this image that he's an international statesman, that he actually engages with the press. I'm very curious to see whether he will do as his grandfather did. We know his father didn't engage with the foreign press, but I'm hoping that his grandfather will. His grandfather did meet with and give interviews with foreign media, so I'm kind of hoping that, and I do expect that in the coming weeks and months that we will see him give his first international interview with the foreign media. But yes, I mean, if things go well, we could see a lot of change. We could see this usher in a period of quite a bit of change when it comes to how the North Korean leader interacts with the press and with the outside world.
Well, actually, I have a quick comments and question. I do believe with these latest developments, and we certainly hope that there might be some increased opportunities for North Korea and as a matter of fact, the world to engage with each other. And you believe, Jean, in the process, there are potentials, but North Korean government will do whatever it can actually to put maybe tighter control or at least to place the system that they've been using in place. They want to ensure that that system is still in place. So what's your bet? Do you think there will be some potentials for engagement, and in that engagement that could open up the country a little bit, or we will have to see pretty much a status quo that we've been witnessing so far for many, many decades?
The North Koreans have been very good at controlling engagement. They've been there have been a number of groups that have been engaging the North Koreans for years, and they're very good at controlling the depth of that engagement. So, and I don't think that will change. You know, even I do think it was significant that I was allowed to open a bureau there. I did go in at a period when I saw that North Korea was seeking to reach out to the United States. That said, I've seen a real scale back in how much access foreign media have been allowed subsequently. I should mention that AFP was allowed to open a bureau there, which is good, but we're still, frankly, not seeing better access for foreign media on the ground. They're very good at managing and controlling engagement. And I think that it will require any of their partners, the South Koreans or whoever it is who goes in to work with them, to really push the envelope and really push the North Koreans to loosen up. It's going to be a challenge. I don't think anyone should go in thinking that they're going to be so much more open. They're going to continue to exert control over those relationships.
If I could make a comment, one of the things that I think is likely to happen is there will be this continued effort to control access to information, what information is provided, and so forth. At the same time, when you start certain amounts of information flowing into an area, or when people find out things, it has a very expansive effect. And the one thing that the studies that have been done on information inside North Korea is the impact of people talking to each other, the use of the cell phones that Jean mentioned. I think once information starts going into North Korea, once there's some increased access, that kind of is the wedge that will press and make it easier for other information to get in, and the information that does get in will be circulated more broadly. I think it's a slippery slope for the North Koreans, and I'm delighted that it is, because I think there's something to be said for this access to information. I think it'll happen.
There are a couple different channels. There is the illicit way of sending information in, which we've talked about, but there's also the sanctioned way of sending information. And I just wanted to mention that Asia Foundation has a program where they send books in on a regular basis, American books, into North Korea. That's a sanctioned route of providing information. Likewise, I negotiated the right to bring in information as the bureau chief. This is another sanctioned route to information. There are ways to bring information in that will not get the locals in trouble, and that's something to keep in mind as well, that we need to be trying to find ways to bring information into the country using both channels.
And one of the problems that U.S. policy has had by restricting access to North Korea, we are limiting our opportunities
Absolutely.
to get information into North Korea. Americans should be able to travel there, not for the Pyongyang Marathon, but for other things where there's more meaningful engagement with North Koreans.
And on that note, I'm quite curious, because we have so much attention focused on this upcoming summit, will the summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un some kind of be a big trigger for more opening up of North Korea and more information into North Korea?
I may add some opinion. Actually, I read a very interesting article about what the North Korean elites who are working abroad reacted to the cancellation of President Trump's summit. So when the news was known, they got to know that news that the summit might be canceled, and they were so frustrated because they wanted to have something new happen in their country too. So we don't know what the U.S. DPRK summit will eventually lead us to, but they also have that kind of hope, something that they haven't thought would happen in their country. And then one of the North Korean defector I talked to last night, and he told me that even though you are a dictator in your country, I mean in North Korea, there are people, there are younger people who wanted to something changing, something new. So as long as there's that kind of hope there, I mean, you need to do something to entertain them. I mean, I think it's a whole different way of thinking. So maybe, I mean, we need to adjust ourselves to a new situation. But I don't think that kind of a thing is going to happen not by Kim Jong-un's decision, but by the developments of the situation. That's what I thought. Yeah.
Just quick follow-up. I think your question is sort of related to the first question we sort of tried to answer. And I think I have two things. One, as Ambassador King put it earlier, I think all these political developments do create some type of potential for the need for more news and information inside the country. That's the number one factor. Second, I think there's always a risk to the point of a regime. There's always chance of unintended consequences or some sort of repercussion. Whether the regime likes it or not, as it's trying to engage with the outside world, I think it also increases, the chance for the need in the country and sort of pressure, I guess, on the regime to allow more freedom. Allowing domestic mobile phones has been viewed as, by some experts, as the regime's effort to satisfy some of the needs of the elites. So I think we also have to consider the quote-unquote unintended consequences of this, all this, opening up. Yeah.
I want to move on to the next question. So what should be the role of South Korean government and the U.S. government in future endeavors in putting information into North Korea? Ambassador King. You can start.
The first thing is that they should work together. It seems to me that we are much more successful if we're cooperating. And we have had, during the time that I was the special envoy, we had a very good relationship with the South Korean government. And I think that it's important that both sides see this as an effort that we're both engaged in. The South Koreans are better at seeing it that way than Americans, who are sort of used to elbowing their way into wherever they want to go. But I think that South Korea has a great deal to offer, and I think the cooperation makes a big difference in terms of what we do.
I'll just make one quick comment. I think Seoul has the advantage of being close enough to North Korea, and it has a lot of political and economic influence as well. U.S. does have a potential leverage, but I don't think it's an influence yet. So I think, as Dr. King suggested, there got to be some sort of a close coordination between two allies here.
But I want to point out that South Korea, the South Koreans have not had much access over the past 10 years because of the hardline policies of the two previous administrations. So I find over the past 10 years that South Koreans probably know less about North Korea than many other of the partners in the region because they've had so little access. And so I do try to encourage South Koreans to work with. There's sometimes a feeling that, well, we're Koreans, so we know this issue best, and we should be leading the way, but also talk to partners in Europe and the United States who have had access, or in Southeast Asia or China, Russia, because you have not. So that's something that we need to consider, is that South Koreans have not had much interaction over the past 10 years.
And I think one of the problems with South Korea is that the political swings
back and forth,
tend to go back and
whiplash.
forth. And it's, at least in the United States on this issue, we tend to be fairly consistent from regime to regime. One of the few issues, the passage of the North Korean Human Rights Act extension by the House of Representatives this year, passed with only 2 dissenting votes. I think it's probably one of the few pieces of legislation that made it through the House this year without major hassle.
Well, if I add some Korean side of the story, I think we need to raise some awareness that we need to send more information to North Korea. It's very simple, but as I told you, I have been living in Korea, but I have never thought of whether we are doing this kind of thing. I mean, there's broadcasting into North Korea, which I said I knew something was going on, but I didn't really knew what was really going on. So if we care more about what we need to do, then that will be more helpful. I mean, for example, we had a loudspeaker thing, which is more like a psychological word things. Well, I saw some YouTube things. They analyzed the contents that the loudspeakers tried to convey them. So what was the best reaction from North Koreans? I don't know whether it's confirmed or not, but the first one is weather report, because the North Koreans who are living in that area, who can listen to their loudspeakers, they are living in a very isolated situation. So weather report is very valuable information for them. So those kind of experience and information, then we may develop, our way of just going into North Korea in a more efficient way.
Yeah, Ms. Kang just mentioned about weather, and I do want to ask Marie about this and open up to other speakers here as well. What kind of contents should we focus on?
Yeah, so in our surveys, and also when you talk to escapees who have since left, across the spectrum of society, they are interested in the full spectrum of content. Some, particularly now, as there's a lot of changes, talks of on the summit and opening, would be important to share with them what are we doing and what do we see as the situation. So one gentleman in particular, I recall, said something along the lines as he was actually interested in international politics and U.S.-North Korea relations because it impacted prices in the market, and he wanted to know what that was going to be so he could anticipate that in his activities. So there's going to be the demand from them, but also making sure that they're getting a clear message on what it is we're actually, the rest of the world is thinking on these topics. One brief story that I found particularly striking, one woman, we were not necessarily asking her about information or foreign media consumption, but we asked her, what do you think of North Korea's nuclear weapons program? And she said she didn't like it because it was against international law. I would venture to bet that she did not learn that from a domestic source. She got it from foreign information. And so even on topics like international law, there's at least one person in North Korea who would be interested in hearing that kind of content.
However, I should point out that there is a movie called The Country I Saw, and I happened to it was on TV when I was in North Korea, and there had just been, I think, a ballistic missile launch by North Korea, and my crew and I, my North Korean staff and I were having dinner, and we saw on TV a UN Security Council meeting, and we all jumped up because we thought that the Security Council had issued another resolution, but it was actually a movie. So so then we sat down and realized, oh, this is a movie. So there is state-sanctioned content that does show that they violated UN Security Council. So they actually are aware that this is a violation. They just phrase it and package it differently. So there is some state-sanctioned content that does show the missile program as an act of defiance.
I do want to give my audience some chance to ask you questions. Just a quick announcement that this is being live streamed at www.insidevoa.com and also being live streamed over the satellite. Who would like to give questions? When you do, please raise your hand. Please tell us who you are, who you're affiliated with, and tell us who you want to direct the question to. And actually, our team wants you to step up to the floor and give questions.
Hi, my name is Abdul. I'm a PhD student at Florida International and working with BBG as an intern. So my question is for Marie. You talked about you conducted the survey. So I was just curious, what does this tell us about the larger population in North Korea?
Well, based solely on the survey we conducted, we wouldn't want to make assumptions about all of North Korea. It does help to see what people living in North Korea are thinking. So we got statements from people who are actually still living there. A way that we like to analyze the information and try and make broader implications is by looking at what other escapees, defectors in other countries are saying. And for the most part, it is along the same lines. Now, of course, defectors and escapees, they do not necessarily represent the entire country. They've already voted with their feet and left the country. So they're not necessarily representative of the entire population either, but you do start seeing a bigger picture by talking to people who are currently in the country, people who've gotten to travel there, and in combination with those to kind of get a sense of what are people actually thinking as they're living there now.
We're waiting for another question. Yes, Mr. Tokoda.
Yeah, I'm Mark Tokel of the Korea Economic Institute. My question is really for anyone. If you could put one or two items on the list of U.S. asks or requests for the upcoming summit, what would you ask North Korea to do?
There's so many. Where do we begin?
Are you specifically talking about the broadcasting efforts outside to? Well, I would ask the regime to allow us a bureau in Pyongyang.
Well, you might have to ask the U.S. Treasury to alleviate some of the sanctions.
I know you've dealt with a lot of things, and that's why I need to talk to you.
For me, my big ask would be to allow the people to have internet access. I think that that would be a big step toward giving them access to information and showing that you are ready to join the rest of the world in giving your people the freedom to information.
I think I would echo what Ginny just said. I think that might be the most closest thing you can imagine or speculate in terms of the regime trying to make efforts to ease a little bit of restriction on its information, control. Yeah.
The difficulty of dealing with the context in which these issues are going to be raised is that there's a lot of distrust on both sides. And just as the Libya model is not likely to be a way that's going to solve the problem of nuclear weapons, I think when we look at information, we've got to be careful not to take a Libya approach as well. We need to sort of wedge the door open a little bit at first, and the more we open the door, the easier it's going to be to push it further. My sense is that any kind of activities that involve engagement between North Koreans and Americans, in particular looking at our situation, and the same thing I think is true with South Koreans as well, is going to be helpful. Access to information, I don't think they're going to start by allowing access to the internet, but they might start by allowing the Pyongyang Symphony to come to New York, and by having some kind of exchanges. There's an advantage in bringing a symphony orchestra to the United States. In the first place, most security officials don't play violin, which means you're going to get 100 people here who aren't security people. Now, they will be surrounded by security people, but these are people who are going to get an impression of what the United States is like. And I think what we've got to do is look at some modest steps that we can take and push the door a little bit open, and then we can kind of elbow our way in later.
Next question? Yes.
Resai Poch from the Khmer service at VOA. I know this is very early stage and the summit has not taken place yet, but in the long run, does anybody, any of you think that reunification is possible?
I mean, anything is possible in that way. Well, it's for me, it's like your country is divided, so something needs to be, because it's somewhere in the middle. So I think it should be fulfilled. That's what I felt like. So, but I don't know whether the U.S. DPRK summit will lead us to the reunification eventually, but if it goes well, and so that we can just open the door more open, of the North Korea to outside the world, and then I think it's a very important step toward that, that goal.
I lived in Germany for 7 years, and during the time that I lived in Germany, Germany was divided. I did not expect in my lifetime to see unification take place. And when it came, it was not something that was planned out and thought out and worked out very carefully. It was an accident, and it happened. I was in Berlin 1 week after the wall came down. I was at Rosenheimer Platz as they started pulling out the concrete slabs that had formed the wall. There's a possibility. How we do it, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure that people looking at Germany in 1988 said, this is the way we've got to move to see the reunification. I think the best thing to do is be prepared for eventualities. But the most important thing, and one thing that was very significant in Germany, is that access to information in East Germany was everywhere in East Germany you could have access to West German radio and television. And that made a big difference in terms of attitudes and values. And I think information is the key to what we've got to work on most importantly.
Right, on that note, we will have to wrap it here. I just want to make a quick announcement that VOA Korean Service is planning a quick tour at the VOA Korean Service. Anybody interested, please stay around so that you can come up to our Korean service. And please, let's give a big hand to our distinguished guests and speakers today.
very important tool for both health and safety and for the imminent threat of the product declining rapidly. I have signed the first one of those. I expect the Sunrise project on the Lolo National Forest I signed last week on Regional Forester Martin.
That is refreshing, and it's very good to hear, Chief. Given the sometimes lengthy approval process in time with ESDs, what can Congress do to encourage faster and more extensive use of this tool by the agency?
Thank you, Senator. You know, I think it's just understanding the process and the balance. Obviously, we take this this tool very seriously, but we need to not abuse it. So we want to be strategic and really look for the areas where those health and safety or critical decline in the product are in place. So working, you know, your voice in the communities, that we'd like their early involvement in the scoping, so we can move out quickly. So, you know, we do this in a transparent way with communities and citizens that care. So your help in getting communities to work with us quickly, I think will help down the line, and your continued support of the tool, that we can sustain it and uphold it as it was intended to be used.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Rupert, could you discuss the economic as well as the environmental benefits of carrying out restoration efforts as quickly as possible following large fires on DOI lands?
Sure. I think, so restoration, just to sort of identify that as being slightly different than how we would approach, say, emergency stabilization, which happens immediately after the fire. So restoration, rehabilitation, as we get into that, I think in a lot of ways it's location, location, location. There are many areas around the country where getting in there immediately, and this is, so this is sort of it's a local stakeholder-driven need that I think we have here. There are some places where getting in there, immediately getting work on the ground, immediately getting trees replanted is absolutely makes the most sense to get it back to sort of a healthy state that is economically supportive. There are other parts of the country where, quite frankly, we probably don't want to get in there immediately because the conditions that are going to really lead to successful restoration may not be in place until later in the year or a different season or after we have rain. I mean, just a variety of different circumstances. So I think it sort of depends based on location, but there are absolutely many examples where the faster we can do it, the faster we can get in there, the better.
Chief, could you address what impact litigation has on the region's ability to meet its timber and restoration targets?
Yeah, litigation clearly takes focus away from getting our work done. It prevents the critical restoration to create the fire resiliency that we all are trying to achieve. And it, quite frankly, gives pause to our staffs to be pretty risk averse. So if we could work with folks early in the collaborative process, if everyone would come to the table, we are always willing to hear everyone and to work it out. But litigation on the back end really slows down the important critical work that we're trying to do.
It's awfully expensive, too.
Yep.
Wrapping up, Chief, as you know, the most recent forecast from the National Interagency Fire Center predicts above normal fire potential for Montana. I just saw your chart. I took a quick picture of it. It was sitting there for a moment. Oh, there it goes. Here we are in Montana experiencing snowpacks well above average, flooding in many parts across our state. And as you mentioned to us in our briefing here a few weeks ago, there's a lot of variables that go into that outlook. But it looks like we need to buckle up for what looks like to be another tough fire season. Congress recently provided new authorities to the Forest Service, but much more needs to be done to address the significant threats of wildfire. I look forward to working with you to build additional support for some of these litigation protections and reductions in red tape so restoration projects can get done sooner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you both for being here. Let me initially just associate myself with the comments that the chair made with respect to sexual harassment and addressing that issue in both of your agencies. Ms. Christiansen, I couldn't agree with you more. It's a cultural change, and so we have to be vigilant and constant, and we have to have policies and procedures in place. So I look forward to working with you, supporting you, and making sure we're constantly addressing this issue. Let me talk about Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe is important for both Nevada and California. And I know, Ms. Christensen, this is an issue that we've talked about in the past. Over 74% of the area around Lake Tahoe is public land managed by the Forest Service. And after decades of fire suppression, the Tahoe Basin's overstocked forests are highly vulnerable to insect disease and catastrophic wildfires. They lack the diversity in age structure and species distributions to support a healthy forest ecosystem. And forest management projects are essential to the safety of Tahoe's communities and the health of its forests. The threat of a catastrophic wildfire at Lake Tahoe is a top concern for the entire community and both states. So with the increasing outlook for an above normal significant wildland fire potential in northwestern Nevada, as we can see from the maps, what precautions is USFS undertaking to safeguard this area in particular?
Thank you, Senator. And let me just make one quick comment on work environment. It is not a one-day training and we're done. This is a starting point of a long journey.
Thank you.
In regards to Lake Tahoe and many, you know, it's an emblem of a community at high risk with high populations. And it is a good example of a community that is working across boundaries together. You know, I hate to say this, but it's working way up front of any fire and sometimes several years of working across boundaries on both getting the resiliency of the lands in better shape, as you suggested, and the communities prepared to have fire, being fire adapted. And the tools added to the Farm Bill tools from 2012 to what was just recently passed in the omnibus are a great step forward for us to be able to move more swiftly, to get more done, and to stabilize when the fire funding fix goes into effect our operating environment so we can do the investments on the ground. Additionally, the reforms we're doing ourselves internally will help us to get more work done. I'm proud of the increase, 36% of the increase work across the lands, and that means with our interior, with our state, with our local partners. So the principles of what we call the National Wildland Fire Cohesive Strategy, where we need to create the resilient landscapes, fire-adapted communities, and have a effective risk-based response to fire. And I know I have an invitation to, or I want to get me out to Lake Tahoe, and I've been there a couple years ago, and it is a great example. You have some great leadership of working across boundaries.
And thank you, and we appreciate you being participants and the focus in that area, because it's an area where both California and Nevada, the senators have come together with a local community to really address this issue. So we appreciate you being there. Let me jump back to a topic of conversation that Senator Cantwell talked about, which is haze. And I don't think people realize that when there are fires going on in the Northwest, in a particular state, it's not just addressing and impacting that state. If there's fires in California, we see the smoke and the haze in southern Nevada or Reno. And so it has an impact on the region. And for that reason, I'm curious, what is it that you look to address the health benefits or the health effects when it comes to that haze and the issues affiliated with any type of a wildfire? And let me bring this up because I know that you have an Office of Environmental Health that studies the events and their impacts on people's health in particular, but my understanding is that is being defunded. Is that correct?
From at where?
An Office of Environmental Health? Is that not true?
Sorry, I'm not familiar
with that. Okay.
No. I can speak to a partnership that we, the Greater Wildland Fire Community, we've entered into with the Center for Disease Control, and they're really helping us study both the fuel type of from prescribed fire and wildfire and the time of year, and to not only show that the quantity of smoke is different, as Senator Cantwell expressed in this report, but the type of the particulate matter, looking that closely at the particulate matter between wildfire smoke and prescribed fire smoke. We're really pleased that we have such a solid partnership with the Center for Disease Control, because that's going to really accelerate us having the public conversation about how we have smoke.
Thank you. And I know the department I was talking about is in the Interior. Mr. Rupert, do you have any comments?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar, and I'm happy to look more specifically into and give you a good response to that particular question about that office. I would just say that, you know, as we look sort of at where we're at now and where, you know, sort of where we want to go in the future to start to deal with this issue, there's lots of interaction between the wildland fire community and air managers, EPA and others, and essentially I think the shared vision here is that we're much better off under a prescribed fire scenario where we control the circumstances and the volumes and the character of the smoke that's in the air, as opposed to catastrophic, uncontrolled wildfire where we have no control whatsoever. We're stuck with it.
I agree. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Senator. Let me ask about the vegetation management provisions that we included in the omnibus. Chief, can you give me just kind of a status report on the implementation of these provisions that we had included? I think we recognize that, you know, when we're thinking about the physical integrity of transmission and distribution infrastructure, this is key to protect the security and reliability of our energy grid when we're talking about the wildfires. So give me a quick update here.
Certainly, Senator. We have moved swiftly. We have we've done a full analysis of these provisions, and we've given really specific direction to our regions. So as you know, they'll be getting us their plans in by the end of this week. On the utility right-of-way vegetation management, that's more opportunistic. So I've asked every one of our regional foresters to describe how they're prepared to meet the response times that those utilities will require so that we can be timely in allowing the vegetation management projects to move forward. So it's basically direction to our region to be ready and show us how they are prioritizing when those requests come in from the utilities, and to work with them in advance to know what that workload is going to look like.
Okay. And then, Mr. Rupert, are the folks at BLM and Forest Service coordinating on this implementation effort?
Yeah, so there's been very active. Excuse me, thank you. There's been very active ongoing engagement, coordination, looking at coming up with, consistent approaches to this. BLM is well into the process and is very close to releasing an IM informational memorandum, which is a policy, essentially reinforcing sideboards, timelines, and expectations for implementation.
Okay, good, good. There's been discussion already with regards to the unmanned aerial systems. How does DOI and the Office of Wildland and Fire coordinate with Forest Service in terms of the drone program? Do you both operate them separately, and is there some level of communication or coordination that goes on with these assets?
Well, sure. Maybe I'll start. So, the interior UAS drone operations aren't strictly wildfire. In fact, the majority of the drone missions that are flown in interior are actually resource missions. So, surveys and inspections. In the case of wildfire, though, we have a fleet. I think we're approaching 500 DOI-owned drones, and we have several hundred certified operators. Many of those operators are qualified then to operate on a wildland fire incident, and so as the coordination that occurs with that wildfire focus is really similar in terms of establishing those, interoperable standards that allow us to, go into these incidents so that we know we have certified, qualified operators that are capable of piloting these drones in that environment to support the incident response. And so in a lot of ways, it's very similar to how we coordinate all other assets in the wildland fire world. I think that's been one of the really successful parts of this drone implementation, is that we really have taken that wildland fire community-wide sort of implementation standard interoperable approach.
Do we have any sense as to the savings that we might be able to attain by using drones. Obviously, from a safety perspective, it's clear there, but in terms of using the traditional aircraft versus drones for some of the more traditional wildfire tasks, do we have a sense as to what that cost savings might be?
We don't have specific dollar figures, Senator, but it's like any build-up investment, what we imagine, what we can get to, as Mr. Rupert says, in both the resource end of things, you know, the forest health detections that we do across this nation. When we can get that to having drones instead of the aerial surveys, then it's in the magnitudes of tens that the potential savings is. But we're in that innovative stage to how far we're going to be able to go replacing people with the cameras. But we imagine it can be great, and we're going to incrementally work ourselves there.
Let me ask a little bit about that. I was up in South Central Alaska, and I was struck by the amount of spruce bark beetle kill that we're seeing up, beyond the Matsu Valley, up towards Denali. It's an area that I hadn't really noticed the kill. Obviously, the Kenai Peninsula had been decimated some years back, and unfortunately, we're seeing some evidence that, and this is done through the aerial surveillance, but we're seeing evidence that the beetle may be back. It's my understanding that the spruce bark beetle has already decimated over 6 million acres, 1.3 million acres, more than 30 million spruce trees on the Kenai Peninsula alone. So again, we pay very, very close attention to this because of the potential for increased fire threat, particularly down on the Kenai Peninsula right now. But it's not just the Kenai Peninsula. I was looking at my clips this morning, and just in this morning's newspapers around the state, we had a fire down in Gustavus, of all places. This is the Tongass National Forest. Yes. One up in Talkeetna this morning, a small one, and then the first big fire up in interior off of Rosie Creek Road, which is just up from the area where I grew up. So it's fire season for us, and I know that we're projected to have a normal year, but for us, normal is still over, oftentimes, 1 million acres. So this is something that we watch with great interest. What are the agencies doing to work together, again, not just within DOI and Forest Service, but working with the state as we're dealing with some of the beetle kill issues, and again, this resurgence that we're seeing, whether it's down on the Kenai or whether it is now moving more into South Central and into the interior.
Senator, the recent aerial detection survey in 2017, there was 27 million acres flown in Alaska, and there was over 840,000 acres that was recorded forest damage. And you're correct, it's in South Central. There was over 400,000 in this recent survey, largely in the Susitna Valley, in that area, as you described. It's across all lands, so we are working collectively. We have put together a spruce beetle working group, researched that group in Alaska with the Division of Forestry and the Alaskan.
Now, as I understand, that task force was focused on the Kenai Peninsula. Are you expanding this to a broader area? Into the Susitna region or the Matsu region as well?
Yes.
Okay.
That's my understanding. And, you know, there's a spruce beetle website stood up, and we've also awarded a special technology development grant to develop Landsat methods for having a broader look, both spatially and and temporally, at the detecting both the past and the present disturbances across Alaska. So this will help us monitor the insects and disease activity on a larger scale, kind of what gets behind this. We are working in southeast Alaska, the largest area. There's smaller pockets of spruce beetle activity, but the largest area is in Glacier Bay National Park. So our forest health protection program is collaborating with park staff about monitoring and traps this summer. So we are clearly working across boundaries in the park as well.
Well, as we all know, and it's not just in Alaska, we've got the beetle kill, as has been raised by other colleagues. So again, making sure that these forest management tools that we provided you in the omnibus to really do more when it comes to whether it's a thinning, their prescribed burning, just every effort that we can do to reduce that fire risk, but also really working to address the management reforms that we all believe are critically important, as I know you do as well. We have one more vote, and thus the absence of other colleagues here this morning. But if folks do have questions for the record, we will make sure that they come to your attention and would ask that you respond to their concerns as well. I do want to ask one more question, and this relates to the roadless rule there in the Tongass. You know my position on it. I've always said I didn't think that the roadless rule made any sense in a place where it's an area that's just made up of islands, 32 island communities. And so as we are looking to access within the Tongass, the big focus has been, of course, on the limitations that are provided by the roadless rule. You have a petition from the state of Alaska that asks for that exemption from the roadless in the Tongass. So last time you were here, we had a conversation about this and the Forest Service plans. So can you give me an update on the status of the state's petition and when Forest Service might act on that petition?
Thank you, Senator. Absolutely, I can. Secretary Perdue and Governor Walker spoke just on Friday, this past Friday, June 1st. And they agreed to pursue a state-specific roadless rule to address the concerns as swiftly as possible of the Tongass National Forest and the access for timber energy development and many other forms of access on the Tongass. So we are working closely with the state to align the resources to get started immediately. We, the Forest Service, have identified funding and actually the resources in people and staffing and expertise to get started, and we're in close contact with the state, and we'll be glad to keep you up to date.
Well, I appreciate that, and perhaps what we might want to do is schedule a meeting with yourself and the Secretary, if he is available, to further discuss. I'm cognizant that with the state petition, my good friend Senator Risch from Idaho was one that led that in his state, and he's made clear to me that this is not an easy process, it is not a quick process, and it is not a cheap process. And so making sure that that there is a good understanding as to what this process for basically moving forward with this state's petition is, how that is clearly outlined. It's certainly my hope that whatever that process looks like, it does not result in anything that's less than a full exemption from the road list for the Tongass. So I'd like to be able to, excuse me, to be able to speak with both you and the Secretary about that petition. But again, understanding how we can move forward in a way that does acknowledge the reality of the situation that we face within the Tongass. So I would look forward to more discussion on that. With that, I think, as I'm looking through, I don't, maybe this question was asked when I was out on the vote, but have you provided the status on the aerial firefighting use and effectiveness study? That was back in 2012. It's my understanding that the agency launched this use and effectiveness study, so 5 years ago. It's my understanding that we really haven't seen any information that's been released from that work, which, you know, that doesn't make any sense. That's not acceptable. If we've requested it and 5 years later we still haven't seen that release. I don't know if you have addressed this already, and if you have, I apologize, but can you just tell me where we are with that?
Certainly, Senator, and no, I have not addressed it yet.
Okay.
As you know, that's a study to look over a variety of different fire situations, the use and effectiveness. Are we using it appropriately, and how effective is retardant? This is a major investment. A retardant is a critical tool, but we want to know if we're using it correctly. And like any studies, I get frustrated as well, but it takes the amount of time and the variety of fires and different types of fires to have a reasonable study. And it was always intended to be 5 years of field data. So they are collecting that now into a report, and we will see a draft report in the coming months with the final report in 2019.
Well, I understand what you're saying about how we want it to be comprehensive, but I think we also recognize that we, the Congress, have worked to provide you with some resources and some tools that you've been asking for a long time.
Right.
But you acknowledge in your own statement that this is not a blank check to us.
Right.
And so making sure that we're doing right by these reforms, we're doing right by these additional dollars that are coming your way, these additional resources, we want to be guided by things that are going to make some sense. And so, you know, one of the things that I hear is that when it comes to aircraft to achieve certain suppression objectives, that it's a somewhat random thing. It's like, well, what do we have over here? You pull this in. That's not cost efficient. Right. That's not using our money smartly. So I would hope that you're trying to get this into alignment, that we're not going to just blow through the resources that we have this year because we have it, and next year we promise to do it smarter because we're going to have the results of the study. If you have information that can help point you in a better direction now, I would hope that you're setting yourself up to do just that.
Yes, Senator, we are. We actually have implemented last year. The longer study is ongoing, and we look forward to those results. And I am getting preliminarily briefed here soon. But we also have the technology now with our scientists to, within a 12-hour turnaround, have real-time maps to our incident management teams where they can see the effectiveness of the prior burning the window of response in was that effective? Did we just burn through the retardant drops that we thought was going to be effective? So we're doing some real-time learning as well as the longer-term AView study. And with both of those, we are making adjustments, and we will have more information and be glad to work with you on that.
Well, I would appreciate that. I think you heard the similar concerns from both Senator Cantwell and Senator Wyden on this. Again, we see that, yes, these are extraordinarily important assets. We want you to have that, those aviation assets, but we also want to know that we're being smart with all of this, and thus the request for the study back in 2012, and thus the frustration. And actually, if my math is correct, if we really did put this in place in 2012, we're beyond our 5 years now. So
yeah, the first field season, I believe, was in 13.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
Hurry it up.
Okay, we will.
All right. I have no further questions at this point in time. But again, if colleagues have submissions, you will see them. And I know it's not a policy, but maybe we just pray for rain this summer. And we also pray for the safety of the men and women who are out there on the front lines. I think we all know that this is very dangerous, and we have lost far too many as they have been out there on the front lines. So hopefully it will be a safe season. With that, the committee stands adjourned.
And on Capitol Hill today, the House returns from an 11-day recess, members meeting at noon Eastern time for general speeches, and 2 o'clock to start the legislative day. 7 bills from the Natural Resources Committee will be considered, including making Route 66 a National Historic Trail. Bill debate starts at 4:30 Eastern. You can watch that live right here on C-SPAN. And Education Secretary Betsy DeVos testifying before a Senate subcommittee on the 2019 budget request for her department. You can watch that entire hearing tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern, also on C-SPAN.
On Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2, the memorial service marking the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy from Arlington National Cemetery. Featured speakers include family, friends, members of Congress, and former President Bill Clinton. Watch the RFK 50th Memorial Service at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2, cspan.org, or listen on the free C-SPAN radio app.
Last week, President Trump pardoned author and filmmaker Dinesh D'Souza. Mr. D'Souza was convicted 4 years ago for making illegal campaign contributions. Today he talked about his experience and answered viewers' questions on Washington Journal. We'll show as much as we can of this before the House gavels in at noon.
Dinesh D'Souza is an author, a filmmaker, and most recently in the news for receiving a pardon from President Trump. Joins us from Houston, Texas. Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you remind our viewers quickly about the situation that caused you to get that pardon in the first place?
Yes, my college friend Wendy Long was running for the U.S. Senate in New York. This is in 2012. We've been friends for 25 years. I gave her $10,000, which is the campaign finance limit. But I wanted to do more for her campaign, so I convinced two of my friends to donate $10,000 apiece, and then I reimbursed them. That was my violation. I exceeded the campaign finance limit by $20,000.
In a typical case, how would someone else have been fined or punished for doing that? And how did you end up going to a correctional or a facility for that?
Well, the typical case is that, I was a first-time offender. The main point is that my motive was not corrupt. In fact, the candidate, Wendy Long, didn't even know that I did this. I wasn't trying to curry favor or get any kind of quid pro quo. So in cases like that, where no corruption is involved, and my motive was nothing more than what one writer called, misguided affection for a friend, those cases are handled with community service and a fine. But in my case, that was not so.
Was that because of the things you had said or the things you had written or your films about the Obama administration? Did that play into this at all?
I think it did, and my reason for thinking that is twofold. The first is that in the same year, 2012, I released my first documentary film subtitled Obama's America. It was in 2,000 theaters, and I know the president was mad about it because he railed against it on his personal website, barackobama.com. Literally a few weeks later, the FBI came banging on my door. Later, I discovered that there is no case in American history where someone has been prosecuted, let alone locked up, for doing what I did. And that seems to me prima facie evidence of selective prosecution.
And so that's the argument that your lawyer made in this case, and even the White House describing selective prosecution. That's your contention then? You were singled out?
Yes, and in fact, I now know a little more about the case. This is, of course, after my trial. A Congressional Oversight Committee has a copy of my FBI file. Very interestingly, the FBI, when they found out about me, assigned $100,000 at the outset to investigate this $20,000 case. That's strange. And something else that's strange is that they red flag me in the file as a right-wing conservative and a critic of Obama. Now, that shouldn't be in my file. If this was not a political hit, if this was just a routine case, as my prosecutor, Preet Bharara, has said on CNN, there's no reason to highlight my conservative politics.
And even the judge in this case, and you've heard this before, Mr. D'Souza, he said in his judgment saying there was no evidence of discriminatory effect nor discriminatory purpose. He goes on from there. What do you make of that reaction?
Well, here's the problem. We're talking about a Clinton appointee judge. And we told him that the only way to show whether there has been any collusion or whether there has been any political motive is to look inside the FBI file and in the government's file, which is normally obtainable in the discovery process. But the judge flatly refused to let us see the file. So he was depriving us of being able to investigate the very question that he was sort of adjudicating by saying, look, there's no selective prosecution, but he wouldn't let us find out if there really was.
Mr. D'Souza with us for the next half hour. 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8002 for Independents. Mr. D'Souza, the first call from you is from South Carolina. This is Kenny on our Republican line. You're on with Dinesh D'Souza. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to know if this man understands that accepting a pardon is an admission of guilt. So all his little alibis and stuff, he's giving them away by accepting this pardon.
Mr. D'Souza.
First of all, I think that's logically idiotic. If somebody is wrongly convicted of something or is pressured or bludgeoned into making a plea deal, and then you're pardoned, by accepting the pardon, you're doing no more than clearing your record and rectifying the original injustice. So the notion that just because you've accepted a pardon automatically means you're guilty, I think is sort of reasoning for stupid people.
But you eventually pleaded guilty to this.
I did, but you have to realize the process that leads to this. What the government does is they try to threaten you with all kinds of preposterous and redundant charges. We're going to get you for mail fraud. You're like, mail fraud? They're like, yeah, because you put the check in the mail. We're going to get you for bank fraud. You're like, bank fraud? They're like, yeah, because you took the money out of the bank. We're going to get you for filing a false document. You're like, I didn't file any documents. They're like, yeah, but the guys who sent the money in filed an FEC doc. So basically what they do is they say, we're going to send you to prison for years and years. It will destroy your life and your reputation unless you plead to this thing, in which case we'll drop all the rest of it. So the point to remember is that this kind of bludgeoning tactic pressures not just the guilty, but also the innocent into pleading guilty.
Here is Chris from Florida, independent line.
Hey, Dinesh. I want to ask a quick question of Dinesh. Are you an immigrant? Do you immigrate?
Yes, I came to America at the age of 17. I did.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. I had a question about the intersection of like propaganda and information, especially when it comes to media. The Citizen United thing came from a movie, right? And also kind of what you went through came from a movie. And I was just kind of interested in what you thought about the I don't know, the right wing, whatever you want to call it, taking up something that the left uses a lot, which is media. I'll sit and listen. Thank you.
Well, I think that there is a greater realization, not just of the importance of popular culture, but the real emotional power of movies to reach people not just through their heads, but also through their hearts. For years, I was a writer and speaker, and I don't think the Obama administration would have regarded me as important enough to even go after. But in 2012, I released a movie in 2,000 theaters. It's the second highest grossing political documentary ever made. And that movie upset Obama. Now, you know, when I speak on campus, people will say, well, gee, what makes you think he cares about your dumb movie? The reason I think that is because shortly after the movie came out, attacks on it began to appear on a website called BarackObama.com. That's how I know that the narcissist in the White House at that time was upset about my movie.
What kind of things did you say about him, particularly, and why do you think that caused how do you think the White House reacted because of that?
Well, here's a small sample from that movie. Obama had been traipsing around the country basically chanting the phrase, "We are our brother's keeper." This was kind of his argument for economic redistribution and also for Obamacare. Well, I went down to Kenya and I found Obama's actual brother living in a sort of third world slum in the muck of Nairobi. And I interviewed him and I asked him, I said, Obama says that we are our brother's keeper. What has Obama done for you? And the guy says, absolutely nothing. This guy has not lifted a finger to help me. So you have to see that this kind of thing in a movie, when I'm talking to Obama's actual brother, it transcends the debate about Obamacare. I'm actually showing the President of the United States to be basically a two-talking hypocrite. And I think Obama didn't like that. He's a petty, vindictive guy, and he unleashed his capos like Holder and Preet Bharara to go after me.
Gwen in Alabama, Democrats line. Go ahead.
Good morning, Pedro. First of all, I want to ask him a question, then I want to make a comment. Were you not found guilty of campaign finance violation? Were you not found guilty of that?
I was.
Okay. First of all, what is idiotic and stupidity is that you thinking we, the American people, are stupid and idiotic. We saw the stuff that you said about President Obama. As a black woman, you are darn right. I am offended. I am offended that you would go after the first black president to demean and malign him. And what you said about Michelle Obama. As a black woman, you are darn right. We are very upset. And you talking about narcissism. Wait a minute. What about this narcissistic person that's in the White House right now? That's not narcissism. And the only reason you're on TV and C-SPAN, I am very offended that you have this person. When we have African Americans about what the president has done with Philadelphia Eagles, why you don't have some of the Eagles on this morning?
Okay,
Gwen,
we'll leave it there. Mr. D'Souza, go ahead.
Well, I think, you know, as a black person, I would think you would realize that just because someone has been convicted of a crime doesn't necessarily mean that A, they're guilty, or B, that they've received equitable and fair treatment. Our criminal justice system is far from equitable, not just in a racial sense, but also in a political sense. To give you an example that comes from politics, very recently, Rosie O'Donnell, the comedian, admitted that she had violated campaign finance law 5 times in 5 separate jurisdictions. So in theory, 5 U.S. attorneys could file charges against her today. But there's no talk about her being charged. Why? Because there's no corruption involved in her case. Rosie goes, hey, if I gave too much money, just give me the money back. And I would have liked to have gotten that treatment too.
From Florida, Independent Line, Ann, hello.
Hi, I'm very glad to speak to you, Dinesh. We rewatched your movie. It was previously mentioned in one of the other callers. We watched it from the beginning to the end, and I want to thank you for making that movie. My question to you is going to be, when you spoke to his brother and when you went to the grave site of the former president, off camera, can you impart any information on how their society, their culture also felt about him? And number 2, when Eric Holder put you in a cell, how did you feel about? Describe that day.
Well, when I was in Kenya at the Obama family homestead, I got a window into Obama. We think of Obama, oh, he's the first African-American president, he's a civil rights guy. We might think of him in connection with Selma or Montgomery or the civil rights movement. The reality is that Obama's ideology is anti-colonial. Obama himself wrote a book, Dreams from My Father. So part of what I wanted to do is learn about his father. And his father was basically this African socialist who hated the West, hated America, and basically wanted to have global redistribution of wealth away from the industrialized countries and toward third world countries. So a diminution of American wealth and power. And it was my thesis that this is what Obama's son, President Obama, was trying to achieve in the White House, a diminution of American wealth and power. Now, turning to the other part of your question, confinement, I was locked up overnight for 8 months in a confinement center with 120 hardened felons. These were basically the whole gamut, coyotes, drug runners, murderers, rapists, people who typically had served most of their sentence and were now in this confinement center before being released onto the street. It was kind of a harrowing experience, but I'm glad I went through it. I think I came out stronger for it, but I'm very glad now to have my record fully cleared.
What did you learn from it, and does it change your tune as far as the way you produce films or the way you write opinions? Did it shape anything going forward?
I think that the whole experience taught me that human beings are not simply motivated by ideals. They're also motivated by very powerful and much baser instincts of anger, jealousy, hatred, lust, revenge. We tend to think of American politics as some kind of a debate. The liberals think X and the conservatives think Y. One group favors liberty and the other group favors equality. But very often this misses the kind of deeper engines of human discontent that drive human behavior. So I think that my knowledge of human nature and understanding of even the political system is much better now as a consequence of that.
Walk through the day that you heard from President Trump.
Well, it was a remarkable experience. I was working in my study. This was just a few days ago. The phone rang. The number said unknown. I answered. It was the White House operator. She confirmed that it was me. She said, hold the line for the President of the United States. A moment later, Trump came on. He was in a very kind of casual mood. Hello, Dinesh. He goes, I'm sitting here with John Kelly. You know John, don't you? And I'm like, no, I don't know John. I know who he is, but I don't know the guy. And Trump goes, well, you know, we both think you're a great voice for freedom and for America. And turning to the matter at hand, this case, he goes, I got to tell you, man to man, you got screwed. Yes, you committed a technical violation. You should have gotten a fine. But those guys, meaning the Obama guys, went after you with everything they got. It's a terrible injustice. And he goes, in effect, I have the power to correct it. So I'm going to be giving you a full pardon in the morning. I want to give you your life back. I want to clear your record. And then he closed by saying, I want you to go out there and be the great voice for freedom that you have been, but only with a more magnified reach.
A bigger voice than ever are the words he described it. What does that mean to you now?
I think what it means to me is, I mean, it's ironic because the reason I'm getting a bigger voice than ever is because the left is freaking out big time over my pardon. They're making a bigger, a more resounding yell over it than all the other pardons put together. As a result, it tells me that they think that that unleashed, I'm somehow dangerous to their ideology. So I'm going to go out and keep doing what I'm doing, not just with the books. I have a big book and a new movie coming out in August. I've resisted talking about it because I don't want to use my pardon as an occasion to promote my book. But I'm very excited to say I'm in the final stages of editing a movie. This will be my 4th documentary film out this year.
General theme of the book and movie is?
The book and movie are called Death of a Nation, and the two themes that I'm going to deal with are racism/white supremacy, and the other is fascism. These are the two most incendiary labels in American politics. They have both been dropped, not just on President Trump, but on the right. This notion that the right is a fascist. Fascism is a right-wing phenomenon, or that racism and white supremacy are staples of the Republican Party. So these are two themes that are investigated in the book and movie.
From our Republican line from North Carolina, Karen, good morning. You're on with Dinesh D'Souza.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to say that I'm very happy that President Trump pardoned you. And I'm one of the Democrats that voted for Barack Obama twice and then crossed over to vote Republican for the first time in my life. And I wish that you would do something about Angela Merkel, because it wasn't Vladimir Putin that influenced me to vote Republican for the first time in my life. It was Angela Merkel who, when she was up for a Nobel Peace Prize, made those statements. If you can get here, we'll take you in to the Syrian refugees. She sold Europe out for a Nobel Peace Prize that she never even got. And, you know, I don't know if Germany is ever going to come back from what she's done.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say that Europe is facing a serious problem. And I think part of the reason the problem is so serious is because the Europeans take immigrants who seem largely indigestible in European culture. I mean, can a Turk become a German? Can a Pakistani become an Englishman? Europe tends to define identity in terms of birth and blood, or in the case of the French language. America has actually been a better solvent for assimilation than Europe. We've actually done better with immigrants here than over there. But look, I think people tend to attack even President Trump for being a racist, and this is based on the fact that Trump is supposedly, quote, against immigrants. But no, Trump has always drawn the line between the legal and the illegal immigrant. And it's important to realize most legal immigrants who come to America are non-white. They come from Asia, from Africa, from South America, and President Trump has never said that he wants merely white immigrants from Iceland or New Zealand and fewer immigrants from, say, Barbados or Bombay. He just doesn't want the illegal immigrants to be breaking the law and coming here in the wrong way.
Independent line, Washington, D.C. Joe, good morning.
Yeah. Good morning. How you doing? Glad just to take my comment. I just wanted to ask Mr. D'Souza, you know, he's supposed to be a film writer and all. Well, only thing I see is that you're supporting your base, and that's okay. You know, you are designed and equipped to attack Obama when you did it, and now you're being supported by the present administration. It works like that. But what I want to ask you is, at night when you go home, when you sit down, do you look at yourself and you think about, you're not so secure after all. None of us are. We all are Americans, and I think that sometimes when we get so partial that we can do more damage than good. Yeah, you may do some things that might expose and turn the tables, but understand this. At the end of the day, look at the mirror and see who you are. you are still Mr. Dinesh, and you may be in that culture, in that environment that supports you and makes you feel good and successful. That's all well and good.
Okay,
But
Joe.
at the end of
Joe,
the day,
Joe, thank you. Mr. D'Souza.
I'd like to try to say where my politics comes from, because when you talk about things like my base, you know, I don't run for office. I don't have a base.
We aren't going to leave this, but you can find it online, cspan.org. Take you live now to the House, about to gavel in.
The House in order. The chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., June 5th, 2018. I hereby appoint the Honorable Larry Bouchon to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, Paul D. Ryan, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 8th, 2018, the chair now recognizes members from the list submitted by the majority and minority leaders for the morning hour debate. The chair will alternate recognition between the parties. All time shall be equally allocated between the parties, and in no event shall debate continue beyond 1:50 p.m. Each member, other than the majority and minority leaders and minority whip, shall be limited to 5 minutes. The recognizes a gentlewoman from Guam, Ms. Bordallo, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to reintroduce the Coral Reef Conservation Reauthorization Act. This bipartisan comprehensive bill builds on legislation that I have sponsored in the House since 2009 to reauthorize the Coral Reef Conservation Act of 2000. I want to thank each of my 13 original co-sponsors for their support. Representatives Soto, Wasserman Schultz, Hastings, Christ, Castor, Hanabusa, Gabbard, Rattawagon, Gonzalez Colon, Rutherford, Sablan, Plaskett, and Mast. Our bill for this 115th Congress makes amendments to update and strengthen the 2000 law and reflects coral reef conservation work government-wide. Coral reefs are God-given natural infrastructure that provide real tangible benefits to our coastal and island communities, as well as the nation at large. Healthy, resilient coral reefs safeguard against extreme weather, shoreline erosion, and coastal flooding, and serve as natural breakwaters for maritime ports and harbors of refuge. Without the reefs to absorb the blunt force of wave action, many island and coastal communities would simply wash away. Coral reefs also support countless American tourism jobs and valuable fisheries across the United States. According to the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, coral reefs support upwards of 12% of global fisheries and an estimated 25% of all known fish species. In addition, coral reefs are the world's greatest source of biodiversity, covering less than 1% of the ocean floor, but home to some 25% of all known marine species. U.S. territorial waters in the Pacific support the majority of our nation's shallow water corals. Guam, my home, sits adjacent to the Western Pacific Ocean's coral triangle, one of the most biologically diverse and important marine ecosystems on the planet. And yet, the planet's coral reefs are in crisis. 2017 marked a prolonged, unprecedented global coral bleaching event. Guam and the Western Pacific, long home to some of the most well-preserved reefs in the world, were impacted severely. Ocean acidification, warming sea temperatures, coastal pollution, invasion species, and other stressors linked to human activity and global climate change threaten to wipe out these incredibly productive ecosystems. These threats have necessitated special protections and listing under the Endangered Species Act for 25 coral species to date. The Coral Reef Conservation Reauthorization Act addresses these challenges head-on with concrete federal actions and policy changes that will make a difference by first strengthening the federal response to coral reef emergencies, including vessel groundings, natural disasters, harmful algae blooms, and unexploded ordnance underwater. 2, minimizing damage to coral reefs from invasive or nuisance species, vessel impacts, marine debris, and derelict fishing gear. 3rd, directing new federal grant-making for local coral reef conservation projects. 4th, recognizing the importance of coral reef fisheries and the expertise of local fishery and wildlife management agencies. 5th, developing the first ever national guidelines for environmentally responsible artificial reefs. And the last, engaging our nation's marine laboratories, aquariums, sea grant colleges, and coral reef institutes in federally funded research on coral biodiversity, propagation, and resiliency. In particular, our bipartisan bill provides congressional authorization for the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force, codifying Executive Order 13089. Since 1998, Mr. Speaker, the Coral Reef Task Force has coordinated federal and local actions to protect coral reef nationwide. So our bill preserves full voting membership on the task force for the governors of all 5 U.S. territories and the states of Florida and Hawaii. The Coral Reef Conservation Reauthorization Act also authorizes the U.S. Department of the Interior to take action to conserve our coral reefs. Many of our most spectacular coral resources lie within national parks, national wildlife refuges, and marine national monuments. Congress needs to take action to protect our nation's irreplaceable coral reef resources, and that starts with reauthorizing the Coral Reef Conservation Act. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge all members of our House to join us in co-sponsoring the Coral Reef Conservation Reauthorization Act of 2018, and I look forward to working with our House and Senate colleagues to advance this important legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chairman recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Abraham, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize the life of the Reverend T.F. Tenney, who died last week after dedicating more than 65 years of his life to the ministry through the United Pentecostal Church. Bishop Tenney began preaching at the young age of 16. He and his wife, Thetis, were elected to the pastorate when they were just 19 and 18 years old, respectively, to lead a newly formed church in Monroe, Louisiana. It was in Monroe when Bishop Tenney cultivated his leadership skills that would serve him throughout his career and would go on to lead ministries directed toward youth, foreign missions, and the greater Pentecostal church as a whole throughout Louisiana. Bishop Tenney will be remembered as a man who took new ideas and turned them into action. That enthusiasm made him a perfect fit for youth ministry, and he served for 6 years as the youth president of the Louisiana District United Pentecostal Church and 9 years as the international youth president. In 1970, Bishop Tenney relocated to the UPC headquarters in Missouri to serve as the UPC's Foreign Missions Director, a position that allowed him to share his belief in Christ with the rest of the world. Bishop Tenney returned home to Louisiana to pastor a church in DeRidder. Later, he was elected as the Louisiana District Director of the United Pentecostal Church, where he oversaw about 300 churches and 800 other ministers. He served in that post for 27 years before returning to become Bishop Emeritus of the Louisiana District. I am proud that Bishop Tenney called Louisiana and the 5th Congressional District his home, though we know now that he is in his true home with the Father. He was a true man of God who touched the lives of countless people, both at home and around the globe. He published a dozen books, created thousands of YouTube videos, and had a Twitter following of more than 44,000 people, all signs of the incredible legacy of the Christian devotion that he left behind. Bishop Tenney will be greatly missed, and Diane and I will keep him and his family in our prayers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this month, the Federal Reserve estimated GDP will hit 4.8% in the second quarter of 2018. Under the former administration, GDP never hit even 3%. Thanks to tax reform and regulatory relief passed by this unified Republican government, Americans are experiencing economic expansion after 8 years of stagnation. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 1 million jobs have been created since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was enacted. 223,000 were added last month. In May, average hourly earnings increased by 2.7%, and unemployment is at its lowest since 2000. The Conference Board also reports consumer confidence is at a 17-year high. Democrats apparently haven't learned the key to economic progress, promising to raise taxes if given the chance. However, tax cuts and repeal of onerous Obamacare regulations have been pivotal for our economy. Now nearly every measure of success is in our favor. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a little bit today about the PROSPER Act and share some articles that have been published that help explain why the PROSPER Act is so good for our country, so good for students, and needs to be passed. The first article is an article in Forbes by Preston Cooper, May 23, 2018, and I'd like to submit the entire article for the record, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Cooper explains that there is a common misconception about PROSPER that is being exploited, unfortunately, by many colleges and universities and our Democrat friends. He says the Congressional Budget Office score of the PROSPER Act did estimate a $15 billion reduction in student aid over the next 10 years, but only on the mandatory side of the budget. Democrats and many in the media have latched onto this number, which appeared on page 2 of the score, and ignored what the other 35 pages said. But as I have read the entire CBO score, I can tell you the PROSPER Act does not cut federal spending on higher education. The PROSPER Act expands the federal government's flagship student aid program for low-income students, the Pell Grant. To encourage timely completion, the bill provides a $300 bonus to Pell Grant students who take on more than a full course load. Most importantly, the bill makes several regulatory changes aimed at expanding both student and institutional eligibility for the program. As a result, the PROSPER Act adds students who will annually receive Pell Grants by 2027. You'll find that the PROSPER Act will increase federal spending on higher ed by $12 billion over the next 10 years. Changes to student loan repayment options are the largest single source of savings in the PROSPER Act. These changes mostly focus on limiting loan forgiveness, which in practice delivers its benefits mostly to graduate borrowers with very large loans. The bill makes these changes while retaining income-driven repayment options for borrowers to ensure monthly payments remain affordable. In conclusion, the PROSPER Act does not cut federal higher education funding by $15 billion. It increases funding by $12 billion by making new investments in the Pell Grant program for our nation's most vulnerable students. Recognizing budget constraints, the bill partially offsets the costs by reining in poorly targeted and expensive loan forgiveness programs. I welcome the debate over specific provisions in the PROSPER Act, and I hope that those priorities are ones that the colleges and universities will get behind and that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle will get behind. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in honor of Ruth Henricks, a dedicated public servant from my own district in Omaha, Nebraska. Ms. Henricks' dedication to serving all people and treating them with justice and kindness is a model for all. It was early in her career as the CEO at Lutheran Family Services when Ruth was profoundly moved by their mission statement, which is to express God's love for all people. For Ruth, the most important words in that sentence is all. And for the next 41 years of service, 33 of those years as the president and CEO, this mission was Ruth's rock. Ruth received her bachelor's in social welfare in 1972 and her master's of social work in 1976, both from the University of Nebraska at Omaha. When she first started at Lutheran Family Services, Ruth walked into one of the treatment facilities and saw a man with a big tattoo on his arm that read, "Born to Lose." And Ruth wondered, how many people come here every day with "Born to Lose" tattooed on their heart? At that moment, Ruth realized she was born to help others. Ruth's list of accolades and awards include Outstanding Young Woman of America, Who's Who in American Women, Social Worker of the Year, Champion for Kids and Families Lifetime Service Award, Woman of Distinction Award, and the Milagro Award. Lutheran Family Services of Nebraska recognized her 25 years of service by establishing the Ruth A. Henricks Leadership Development Fund. With a passion for helping all, Ruth has served many boards and organizations at all levels, from being a member to chairperson. She's spent a lifetime dedicated to social service and her personal modus operandi to spend your life in service to express God's love for people. That is what Ruth believes, and that's what she's done for so long. Ruth has made a positive impact in our local community of Omaha, in our state of Nebraska, and indeed our country. She's made an impact where it matters most, the lives of others. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman for Kansas, Mr. Marshall, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge my colleagues to be responsible, to be accountable to the American public, and deliver a comprehensive immigration solution. Beyond safeguarding our borders and addressing DACA, it is the responsibility of Congress to pass an immigration bill that provides a workable visa system for our farmers and all agriculture producers back home. No one has worked harder or understands this more than my colleague and former chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Mr. Bob Goodlatte. His comprehensive immigration bill, Securing America's Futures Act, addressed this by reforming the current H-2A visa program. The bill replaces the outdated H-2A program with a new H-2C visa, placing jurisdiction within the United States Department of Agriculture and the Department of Homeland Security. It also allows our farmers to access a stable supply of workers year-round, an important change for our farmers that work 365 days a year. I've worked hard on this provision with Chairman Goodlatte, and I'm thankful for the time he took to listen to our farmers back home and incorporate many of their ideas and solutions into his bill. In Kansas, immigrants make the dairy industry run. They strengthen the farms that provide food on kitchen tables across the country and across the world. And it helped the Kansas agriculture industry become the international powerhouse that it is today. Our farms, our local economy, and all the groceries you buy depend on immigrant labor. To address our current farm labor crisis, We need to create a process that is easier to navigate and allows our farmers to access the labor pool they need. This Congress is focused on keeping our promises, to be accountable, and now is as good time as any, and is actually a great time to bring immigration to the forefront and deliver for our constituents. Leaving this to the chance of a slipshod petition with zero chance of being signed by the President is simply not a solution. I'm all in on finding solutions, and while I certainly understand the complexity of this issue, this Congress has proved it can move mountains when just a few months ago we passed a historic tax reform, and we can tackle our nation's immigration policy by working together. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor Major General Joseph Martin, who serves as the commanding general of the 1st Infantry Division back at Fort Riley, Kansas. I've had the pleasure of working with General Martin and his wife Leanne over the past year and found them to be exceptional assets to Fort Riley as well as the entire community. Although I'm proud of their new journey, I was sad to hear they will soon be departing for a new post. General Martin graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1986 alongside another fellow Kansan, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. General Martin was commissioned as an armor officer and after graduation served as a variety of troop assignments, including leadership within the Combined Joint Forces land component in Iraq, where he partnered with Iraq and allied forces to liberate Mosul. Most recently, he served as the commanding general for the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California. As commanding general of the 1st Infantry Division, General Martin has worked to build readiness among his troops and continues the partnerships with area communities and organizations to support his soldiers and their families during their time at Fort Riley. General Martin has excelled at each post he has served in and will continue to do so at his next assignment at the Pentagon this June. My wife Lane and I would like to be the first to welcome General Martin, his wife Leanne, and family to the East Coast. We commend them for their service to our nation and wish them and their family the very best of luck at their next post. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until 2 p.m. today.
And the House back at 2 to start the legislative day, and bill debate starts at 4:30. 7 bills members will be working on today from the Natural Resources Committee, including making Route 66 a National Historic Trail. Any votes will be held after 6:30. You can watch live coverage of the House here on C-SPAN. And Education Secretary Betsy DeVos testifying today before a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on the 2019 budget request for her department. We'll show the hearing tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern. Sunday on Q&A, New York Times columnist Ross Douthat talks about his book To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism.
He thinks that the church needs to change in various ways, particularly, I think, around issues related to the sexual revolution, marriage, divorce, and so on, where prior popes basically said these are changes the church can't make. And so there have been these sort of fraught places in his pontificate where he has clashed with cardinals and bishops and theologians over just how far he can push the church to change, what the church can change without either undercutting its own traditions or breaking faith with the New Testament, the Gospels, Jesus Christ.
Q&A, Sunday night at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN. President Trump tweeted this morning, "The Russian witch hunt hoax continues, all because Jeff Sessions didn't tell me he was going to recuse himself. I would have quickly picked someone else. So much time and money wasted, so many lives ruined, and Sessions knew better than most that there was no collusion." This morning we talked with a former federal prosecutor about the Russia investigation and special counsel Robert Mueller. This is from Washington Journal.
This is Nelson Cunningham. He's president and co-founder of McClarty Associates, but also a longtime observer of investigations, particularly of a presidential nature, and joining us to talk about the state of the Robert Mueller investigation. Good morning to you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Could you give our folks a little bit of your history, not only in the White House, but also in the Senate, especially when it looks into presidential investigations?
Sure. I started life as a lawyer, and a litigator at a law firm. I was lucky enough to be hired by Rudy Giuliani in New York to be one of his young assistant U.S. attorneys. That was 30 years ago last month. Rudy swore me in. I spent 6 years in that office, loved that work. I was lucky enough to work with terrific lawyers. For most of the 6 years I was there, just down the hall from me was Jim Comey, who also started life in that office. I then moved from there to work for Joe Biden when he was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I became his general counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee, working on constitutional and criminal law issues. This was in 94, 95. In 95, I moved to the Clinton White House, where I spent 2 years as general counsel for the White House Office of Administration, essentially working on all the underpinnings of the White House. But the reason they brought in a former prosecutor and a former Senate official was because of the independent counsel investigations and the congressional investigating committees that were just starting to investigate President Clinton. So that was very much my life when I was at the White House for 2 years. And then I went on to foreign policy, which is where I spent most of the last 20 years.
With that scope then, particularly as you look at investigations, what do you think about the current state of Robert Mueller's investigation, and how long before we see some resolve to it?
Yeah. You know, as somebody who worked on complex white-collar investigations back in my past, somebody who's watched the Clinton impeachment go forward, who's watched many complex Washington scandals unfold, you get a feel for these things. And so I've matched my thinking about watching the Mueller investigation with what we know coming out in the press. And I wrote a couple of pieces in Politico that laid out what I think is going to be happening in the coming months. And the first piece looked at how will Mueller wrap up his investigation. And there are a couple of things that are clear to me. One, Mueller is reaching the end of his investigation. I know there are new revelations every day. I know the newspapers are full of it, but you have to understand, we only know, as outsiders, we only know a tiny fraction of what's actually going on in a criminal investigation. It's like an iceberg. 7/8 of the iceberg is underwater, and we only see a fraction of it. Often we only see it months later. We learn of something that happened in January or February. We learn it today. So Mueller, I think, is further along than most people would think. And one of the reasons I believe that is because of the intense discussions that have been going on over whether to interview President Trump. That's clearly going to be one of the final stages of an investigation such as this. Remember, how did Jim Comey end his email investigation of Hillary Clinton? July 2nd, they had the interview with her. July 5th, he announced his findings. That's the way a prosecutor will work on this. So you feel that he's coming to an end.
Let me invite callers to call and ask you questions before we go on. It's 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats and Independents, 202-748-8002, and you can make your thoughts or questions on Twitter at C-SPAN WJ. When it comes to that potential interview with the president, what is the difference between the president agreeing to do an interview and being subpoenaed for an interview?
Well, this is the issue that Bill Clinton faced 20 years ago. Remember, he was sued in the Paula Jones case for sexual harassment. He challenged that. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided unanimously that a president must be subjected to a civil case. The president must accept process. The president must appear. If called to testify, the president must testify. The court made clear, look, he's the president. You have to make allowances. You have to pick the days. You have to do it in ways that fit his schedule. He has important responsibilities. But the court unanimously said a civil case can go forward, and the president can be required to testify in that civil case. Frankly, in a criminal case, it's even stronger. Any judge will tell you that a criminal subpoena trumps a civil subpoena. So if Bob Mueller subpoenas the president, there is clear court precedent, both the Clinton versus Jones Supreme Court case, then earlier the unanimous U.S. versus Nixon Watergate tapes case, which was also unanimous, requiring Richard Nixon to comply with the criminal subpoena and to turn over the Watergate tapes. I think there's really no debate at all, despite what you see in the newspapers, about whether or not the president would be required to testify if he's handed a subpoena. Now, no president wants to be handed that subpoena. Bill Clinton was handed that subpoena by Ken Starr at the end of the Starr investigation. At the end of the day, his lawyers negotiated a limited time, 4 hours, 6 hours. The president was able to testify from the White House. He didn't have to have the indignity of walking into the grand jury room. He has lawyers sitting next to him, which is not common, which is not what you would have if you went into the grand jury. And the grand jurors watched it live on TV. That's what I expect is going to happen here. And what we're seeing right now, this loud back and forth, is all just loud negotiating tactics over coming to a fairly predictable solution, which is Mueller has that subpoena power, and the president doesn't want to be subpoenaed. He'd rather do it voluntarily.
Your former colleague, Rudy Giuliani, directly involved in this process. Yeah. What do you imagine his role is in trying to negotiate this? And
well, he's obviously a very good negotiator, and he's also someone who I think has the president's ear and can relate, and the president can relate to him, and that's obviously important when you're dealing with a client like this. I think what Rudy's been doing in the last couple of weeks is, frankly, let's just say sometimes in the law, precision helps, and sometimes obfuscation helps. And I think maybe he's obfuscating a bit. He's throwing up a lot of arguments. He's throwing up a lot of issues. One of his goals, I think, is to make the whole thing seem to the public so confusing and so vague and so on the one hand, on the other hand, that either they begin to lose interest or, frankly, they think that whatever Mueller does may not be that important. And that's where we get to the fact. I do think Mueller will issue his report this summer. He doesn't want to interfere with the midterm elections. That's a principle that's drilled into prosecutors. It's one of the reasons why Jim Comey was criticized. Mm-hmm. He did it too close to the elections. Mueller will finish his investigation. I don't think he'll indict the president. That's a constitutional rabbit hole. You could go down that for months or years. That's not Mueller's intent. He wants to find the facts and get them out. So he'll produce a report. That report goes to Rod Rosenstein at the Justice Department. And then this is where it's different from the Starr report of 20 years ago. Starr was operating under a statute that required him to write a report and then required him to send that report to Congress. That statute's expired. The special counsel regulations governing this matter are very different. Rosenstein gets the report and then he can just sit on it. There's no requirement that he make it public. If he does make it public, of course, he has to also comply with grand jury secrecy rules. He has to comply with classified information rules. It makes you actually wonder, will we ever see a full report in public because of the classified nature and the grand jury secrecy involved here? But once that report goes to Rosenstein, if he does choose to make part of it public or to forward it to the Congress for their consideration, that's when you reach, I think, a moment of potential constitutional crisis, because President Trump has made it clear he does not want that report to go forward.
We'll talk a little bit about that, but we have some calls lined up for you. We'll start with Dawn in Michigan, Republican line. You're on with Nelson Cunningham, here to talk the state of the Mueller investigation. Go ahead.
Yes, they keep comparing this to Clinton and Nixon and so on and so forth, but I think we have a precedent here that there is actually a contrived situation that was set up to try to make it look like something happened, and now we're wanting the president to comment on that in an interview. I just think that doesn't even make sense. Who's going to comment or who's going to interview on something that they never set up in the first place, that is really a contrived situation from what it appears from the FBI and the CIA, Brennan, Clapper, all of that?
Mr. Cunningham.
Well, you're obviously referring to what's been called the Spygate incident. How did this investigation begin? And there's a couple of things that I think it's very important to note. First of all, it's clear from the facts and it's clear from what's come out that the investigation actually began because of Papadopoulos and the information that he passed on in the spring of 2016, that he'd heard that the Russians had tons of emails from the Democrats. In July, when emails, in fact, were dumped through WikiLeaks, the FBI began an investigation based on Papadopoulos. When they had heard that there were perhaps efforts by the Russians to contact the Trump administration, they went to one of their longtime sources, a Republican political appointee who's now been identified as Stephen Halper, and asked his help to try to contact these individuals and see whether, in fact, they had heard from the Russians. He did that. I know it's been called Spygate. I must say, ma'am, I don't view it as contrived. I view it as what any of us would want the FBI to do if we had evidence that there was a foreign government trying to interfere with a political party.
Edwards in Washington, D.C., Democrats line. You're next.
And how you doing, Pedro? Yeah, I worked under the State Department, and I know the intelligence business very well. And I think Mueller is doing a great job. And to your guest, Cunningham, you're a breath of fresh air, you know, and I like what you're saying. And having worked on this investigation should go to its completion, and we'll find out that this man is an enemy of the state, and we cannot allow him to go to office. He's endangering our nation. Who is standing up for the United States of America? So I swore on the Bible that I will protect the United States of America. Being a PhD African-American scientist, I'm proud of this country.
So Nelson, your question for our guest specifically.
Yeah, I guess Mr. Cunningham, what do you suggest that we go forward? Can you inform our people, the Republicans and the Democrats and all the people across the nation, they should listen to fact-check news only and continue this investigation?
Okay, Edward, thanks.
Yeah. Well, this is exactly why I think someone like Mueller is what we need. He is himself a longtime Republican political appointee. He's put together a staff of current and former prosecutors. I know there are claims that they are angry Democrats. I can tell you that Ken Starr's investigation 20 years ago was staffed with many, many Republicans, including Rod Rosenstein, in fact, worked for Ken Starr. The current Secretary of Labor worked for Ken Starr. The later Solicitor General worked for Ken Starr. His team was heavily Republican, but I'll point out Starr himself was Republican, so that was an all-Republican lineup. What we have here is we have Mueller, who is himself a Republican, appointed by a Republican, Rod Rosenstein, who was appointed by Donald Trump. And Mueller, for 30 years, has been he has been a legend in law enforcement communities since long before he was FBI director. He is someone who really has widespread trust. Until this investigation began, very few ever questioned his ethics, his standing, his work ethic. I believe that at the end of the day, he believes his job is to come up with a report that covers the waterfront, that answers as many questions as possible, and that tries to lay this matter to rest. And I think we're lucky to have someone like Mueller there. And frankly, we're lucky that he comes from Republican roots, because I think that will help persuade many that this was in fact a fair investigation.
Nelson Cunningham, our guest. It's 202-748-8001 for Republicans. For Democrats, it's 202-748-8000. And Independents, 202-748-8002. Greg is in Huntsville, Alabama, Republican line.
Good morning. Yeah, a couple of questions for you. The dossier that was bought and paid for, that generated some of the interest in this collusion, that is repeatedly been brought to the attention of American people, just cast doubt on everything about this investigation. It was just the start of a small conspiracy. It was just the start. In my mind, it cast doubt. As a Republican, I voted for the president. As a Republican, I'm supporting the fact that a lot of positive things are happening in the country. And the reasons, Obama did some good things, Trump's done some good things. I think it is time to shake up trade deals, so on and so forth. I'm looking forward to getting to the bottom of it. As a Republican, we don't fear it. I don't think it has to be the absolute forefront of the news each day, and that the hate has to be spewed from every news station. Just get to the bottom of the investigation. Let's take a look at what happened, and let's take action then. But let's keep in mind one thing we're kind of missing here. We seem to ride to the space station with Russia. We seem to share all of our projects with Russia. We depend to get back from the space station with Russia. They're an economy about the size of Texas. They're not our largest threat. This Russia conspiracy, Russia collusion, I'm not that worried about Russia.
Okay, Greg, thank you.
You make a very good point here, which is that it would be good if this all happened more quietly. It would be good if the investigation could proceed without as much noise as there is. Investigators do their best work when they're able to put their heads down, interview the witnesses, review the documents, and draw their conclusions. without a cacophony of noise all around them. We have two reports, I think, that we can look forward to and that I think are going to give us a lot of answers in the coming months. One is the Inspector General report at the Department of Justice. That's the internal policeman, as it were, at the Department of Justice, who's been asked to look into how did the Clinton email investigation, how was that handled? How was the end of it handled? To look into how did this, the investigation into the Trump campaign begin? Michael Horowitz, who's the Inspector General, I knew him. He actually, although he was down the hall on the other side from us when we were all young prosecutors in New York, we all worked together. And Michael Horowitz is a very serious lawyer and investigator. His report's going to come out maybe as soon as this week, and we'll learn a lot from that. And then second, Bob Mueller's report. So I think it would be probably good for all of us to hold our breath a little bit and wait to draw judgments on whether things were either contrived or whether someone is the devil until we actually have the reports in front of us.
The president sending out a tweet raising out the possibility of the ability for him to pardon himself in this matter. First of all, what's the legal standing on that, and what do you think about him even raising that issue?
Well, nobody knows whether a president can pardon himself. It hasn't come up. It has not been ever decided by the Supreme Court. We have the basic proposition that no man is above the law, and that suggests that someone should not be his own adjudicator and pardon himself, but it hasn't been tested. But I think it's actually a red herring, because while the president might have the power to pardon himself, he clearly, of a crime, he clearly does not have the power to pardon himself from an impeachment. And we know that because the Constitution itself says in the pardon clause, the president shall have power to confer pardons except in cases of impeachment. Now, I don't believe Bob Mueller is going to indict the president. I don't believe he's going to bring him to bear on criminal charges, so the president won't have a need to pardon himself. If he does recommend impeachment, the Constitution is absolutely clear. The president cannot pardon himself from an impeachment.
Let's go to Texas. Democrats line. Alan, good morning. You're on with our guest, Nelson Cunningham.
Good morning. I just, why is there a Russian around every corner with this Trump guy? And, it's just ridiculous. We know that Trump has the ability, the way him and Cohen use LLCs, we know they have the ability and the know-how to launder money, to hide money. It's just, he acts so guilty, and, he'll do anything to win, and that means colluding, conspiratorializing with Russia, and it's just, and he acts like a guilty man. And what can we say?
Well, Mueller has put together a team that is perfectly designed to get into the very issues that you raise. He has some of the best prosecutors and former prosecutors out there on criminal tax fraud, on international money flows, on money laundering, on complex criminal organizations, on cybercrime. These are the best there are that we have. And they've now been spending a year investigating this, gathering all the documents, interviewing all the witnesses. If there's a there, they'll find it. And I think because they all come out of career prosecutorial service, if there's not a there, they'll acknowledge that.
This morning, there's a new charge laid against Paul Manafort from Robert Mueller, this for witness tampering. What do you think about that charge and the larger scope of the investigation? And how does Paul Manafort play in the larger scope of this investigation?
Well, Manafort right now is in a key position. He is the only he's the only American who's been indicted by Mueller who has not yet pleaded guilty. The others, Michael Flynn, Papadopoulos, even Manafort's co-defendant, Rick Gates, have pleaded guilty. Manafort sits out there. His trial has one trial in July, one trial in September. He is, frankly, just looking at this from a cold-blooded prosecutor standpoint, he is a dead man walking. He is 69 years old. He's facing counts in both jurisdictions that are absolutely ironclad. He took millions of dollars from the Ukrainians, the Russian sympathizing Ukrainians. He failed to report himself as a foreign agent. He failed to pay taxes on that money, and he hid it through offshore accounts. It's absolutely cut and dried. Now, his co-defendant, Rick Gates, has pleaded guilty and is cooperating with the prosecutors. Paul Manafort is 69 years old. The only way he's going to avoid spending the rest of his life in jail is if he pleads guilty and cooperates. So what we're seeing right now is a bit of a dance between Mueller and Manafort over trying to get him to cooperate and to plead guilty. And I think this move of looking to revoke his bail, because Manafort reached out to witnesses in the case against him and basically said, here's what I've been saying about what we've been doing. You agree with that, don't you? I'm paraphrasing. A classic attempt to shape a witness's testimony. Mueller is using this. It's both outrageous for someone to reach out and do that directly, and B, Mueller is using it to increase the pressure on Manafort. If Manafort does plead guilty, if he does agree to cooperate, that really is the last milestone, along with the interview of the president, the last milestone that we have yet standing before Mueller can complete his investigation.
From West Virginia, Republican line, Carl, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Cunningham.
Good morning.
You are a lawyer and a member of the bar, so I'm going to assume that you're going to answer my question truthfully and without spin. Do you think Hillary Clinton was a felon because she destroyed emails that was subpoenaed by the U.S. Congress? And also, when Comey and the guy that's Attorney General now, Assistant Attorney General, Rosenstein, when they took this information from the dossier to the FISA court to get a surveillance of a U.S. citizen, was that, do you think they misled the judge by using the dossier that was paid for by Hillary Clinton's campaign?
Yeah, those are two very good questions. The first one on Hillary's email investigation. This is something I actually know way more about than the average bear, because in my job at the White House as general counsel of the Office of Administration, I oversaw White House email policy. So 20 years ago, I was an expert in something that nobody else knew anything about. I can tell you that keeping documents on a private server was unorthodox. It might not have been wise, but I see nothing and never saw anything that made it illegal to do so. It's like taking papers. It's as though the Secretary of State took physical papers and decided to keep them in her home office rather than in her government office. Then you get into the question, well, were there classified information or not? It turned out there was a smidgen of classified, the lowest level of classified information that was in those papers. You can criticize her for that, but you can't say she was a felon for doing that, for keeping her papers, as it were, in her home office instead of her State Department office. You ask about the destruction of emails. As I understand it, there were some emails that were accidentally destroyed by a low-level employee. I don't think there's any reason to believe that Hillary Clinton ordered that, so I think you'd have a hard time saying that she is a felon for that. And I believe, I may not be right here, but I believe that Comey was able to reconstruct many of those emails from other sources and other devices. Now, on your good second question, which was,
you know what? I apologize.
I'm sorry. I gave such a full answer to your first question, sir. I've missed your second one, but it was a good one.
From Alaska, Democrats line, Stan and Kodiak. Hi.
Hi. That was. I'm on the Republican line. I thought I must have misdialed.
Apologies. Go ahead.
No problem. Would you please tell me where the spy in the Hillary campaign was from the government, so that we know that both were supposedly affected by the Russians? Why aren't we given the information about the spy? That Clapper used that term in the Hillary campaign.
Yeah, there's not any evidence that I'm aware of that the Russians were reaching out to the Clinton campaign except by illegally hacking their emails. There were no contacts between the Clinton campaign and the Russians. There were manifest contacts between people in the Trump campaign and the Russians. It's simply not the same situation factually. The question that was asked by your previous
Who paid for the dossier?
Yeah, and was there something wrong with getting a FISA warrant based on the dossier? Look, you have to remember a few things. The FBI waited to begin their FISA investigation until Carter Page was no longer an advisor to the campaign. They did that on purpose because they did not want to be wiretapping an actual campaign advisor. They waited until after he had formally severed his ties with the campaign, and then they applied for the FISA warrant. I think that's very important to recognize. Second, none of us have seen the full affidavit that went to the FISA court because it's classified. There's been a lot of back and forth on it. There was a paragraph in there that indicated to the court that there was some opposition research that had been involved in the dossier. None of us have seen that actual language. But here's something that's important. Carter Page, for years, had been, in the eyes of the FBI, someone who was a target of Russian attempts to recruit him. 3 years before any of this happened, he was subjected to repeated attempts by the Russians, by Russian intelligence officers in New York to build a relationship. He was counseled. The FBI met with him, said, please don't meet with these Russians. These people are trying to recruit you. And he laughed them off. When in the height of the campaign, Carter Page makes a trip to Russia where he comes back and he says he didn't meet with any Russians, but the FBI has evidence that, in fact, he met with Russian officials who were connected to intelligence. I don't know. That would raise questions in my mind.
Al in Dayton, Ohio, Democrats line, you're the last call. Go right ahead.
Thank you for taking my call, and thanks for C-SPAN. Mr. Cunningham, it's been very interesting and informing this morning. I've been following this. My big question to you is, when are they going to force the president, or Mr. Mueller has them already? His tax returns would end this investigation.
Thank you, caller. We'll have to leave it there.
Yeah, great question. As a prosecutor, the first thing you do in a big white-collar case like this is you get all the records you can. Mueller's been on the job about a year. I am confident that one of the first things he did was send over a request to the IRS for the tax records of Donald Trump and his related entities. And there is a process by which prosecutors can get those tax returns. They have to keep them secret. There's special procedures for ensuring they don't become public. But it's very straightforward for prosecutors to get that when they can make the proper showing. And I'm confident that Mueller has those. I think it's a testament, frankly, to Mueller's investigation. And I don't know anybody there, by the way. I don't know Mr. Mueller. I don't know his top deputies. But I've been impressed with the professionalism. And it's impressive that they have had these tax returns, I believe, and have everything else, and there have been no leaks. And I think that's very impressive. And I think that can give us confidence that at the end of the day, there's a fair process being run.
You said that you imagine there's a time coming shortly when this will wrap up. When do you see that happening month-wise?
July or August. Rudy Giuliani says he was told September 1. I think we can believe him.
Nelson Cunningham talking about the status of the Mueller investigation. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for your guests.
Thursday morning, we're live in Lansing, Michigan for the next stop on the C-SPAN Bus 50 Capitals Tour. State Senate President pro tempore Tanya Shootmaker will be our guest on the bus during Washington Journal, starting at 7:30 a.m. Eastern.
And here on C-SPAN, we'll head back to the House in about an hour, 2 o'clock Eastern Time, to start the legislative day. Bill debate starts at 4:30. Seven bills that members will be working on today from the Natural Resources Committee, including making Route 66 a National Historic Trail. Any votes will be held after 6:30. You can watch live coverage of the House here on C-SPAN. And Education Secretary Betsy DeVos is testifying today before a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on the 2019 budget request for her department. We'll show the hearing tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern.
On Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2, the memorial service marking the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy from Arlington National Cemetery. Featured speakers include family, friends, members of Congress, and former President Bill Clinton. Watch the RFK 50th Memorial Service at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 2, cspan.org, or listen on the free C-SPAN radio app.
Thomas Homan is the acting director of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He spoke today at a forum on his agency's mission to enforce immigration laws. This was hosted by the Center for Immigration Studies in Washington, D.C. It's about an hour and 15 minutes, so we'll watch as much of this as we can before the House gavels back in at 2.
Oh, thanks. It's dim lights. All set? All set?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. This is the second in our series of newsmaker interviews with prominent people in the immigration world. And today we are speaking with Acting ICE Director Tom Homan, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation on everything from sanctuary policies to the influx of illegal immigrants over the border, to potential congressional legislation, deportations, worksite enforcement, and so on. So the way this works is that Tom and I will be speaking for a while, and then we have a process for submitting questions that my colleague Marguerite Telford will be organizing, and she'll pass me those at the end of our time here. So thanks for being here, and let's get started. I appreciate your being here today. One member of Congress, Representative Joe Crowley from New York, issued a letter yesterday suggesting that you back out of this event today, saying that it is inappropriate for you to be speaking with a group that he describes as a white supremacist and anti-Semitic organization. So I'm glad you were able to be with us today. It doesn't look like you took him too seriously.
Well, look, I'm at the National Press Club. What better way to speak about immigration to the American public than be here? So I heard about that letter this morning. I haven't seen the letter, but, they call the CIS racist. I'd like to know, did Representative Crowley send a similar letter to his fellow Congresswoman Yvette Clarke in New York when she stood in front of the ICE building and called us the Gestapo, the Nazis? The most prolific hate group in the history of the world? Did he do that? So I'm here to speak to the American people, and the National Press Club, I think, is a perfect place to do it. There's a lot of misinformation about what's going on in immigration enforcement. I'll take every opportunity I can to talk to the American people and set the record straight.
All right, great. Well, that's why we're here. I'm hoping that you'll reflect a little bit on your time as ICE Director. It's been announced that you're retiring at the end of the month. So I can ask you some hard questions, and this is your chance to have your say.
Well, I've always answered hard questions. I'm not afraid of hard questions. Just whether I'm retiring or not, your questions are going to get the same answers today you got a week ago. So
all right, good.
The answers don't change with who I'm talking to. I can guarantee you that.
So how many years have you been working on the immigration issue?
I became a Border Patrol agent in 1984, so 34 years. I started in Border Patrol, worked the front line. I spent 20 years with investigations, special agent investigating groups that smuggle aliens and traffic aliens in the country. Then I ran enforcement move operation, another division of ICE, which deals with the detention and arrest of aliens inside the United States and their removal. And now I'm the acting director. So one benefit I have is I've lived the entire illegal immigration life cycle from the beginning to the end. So I know illegal immigration pretty well.
I think so. I think you're highly qualified. What was your favorite job or place to be?
There is no one favorite. I was most proud to wear the green uniform. The United States Border Patrol, there's 40,000 American patriots that put their life on the line every day. I was most proud of that. But I was most proud of being a special agent. I can't pick one. And when the president asked me to come back to be the ICE director, I'm proud of that moment because, I was able to get back to enforcing law, which we haven't been able to do in the prior administration. Enforce laws the way they're written. So I'm equally proud of that. So I can't pick one. I think everything I've done within ICE is a positive experience for me. I think There's no one favorite. I got to say that they're all equally important. The border is important, interior enforcement is important, policy and legislation is important. I had my fingers in all of it. Look, I got a front row seat to the biggest issue facing this country, and I think ICE has made a dramatic impact in the past year. A 45-year low in illegal immigration last year. That's not a coincidence. That's because we have a president, President Trump, who's allowing us to do our job. And as shows, when you enforce the law in a meaningful way, it's going to deter further illegal entry. We've proven that. 45-year low. That's not a coincidence. That's because this president is letting us enforce the law.
Okay. And you were, of course, legacy INS. What's different about ICE and enforcement today from the INS, which was a much maligned agency, as you know?
Well, look, in INS, people want to complain about what ICE does. I can tell you, back in the INS days, you know, area control, you know, back in those days, you drive around the streets and you go to airport and you look for people, get reasonable suspicion of alienage. You know, one thing that's changed, which is the most important change that's occurred in the INS days, we'd be arresting whoever we found here in the country illegally, and meanwhile, there are sexual predators and criminal aliens walking out of county jails all across the country that we had no idea they were there. So secure communities was the biggest thing that happened for immigration enforcement. It gave us a virtual presence in every jail across the country. If I get arrested and I get fingerprinted, I'll be screened by secure communities. You know, it's colorblind to those things. So what it's done is make us focus on the worst of the worst. So secure communities gives us a picture in every county jail across the country, like, you know, you have a criminal sitting in this jail. That's something we didn't have in the INS days. So it helps us in our prioritization. It helped us with finding those that are most public safety threats. So that's the biggest difference I've seen in the 34 years I've been here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has made a huge impact. On the other hand, it could be argued, and some have, that the ramp up of the Secure Communities program really energized folks who were uncomfortable with immigration enforcement. And that has led to the proliferation of sanctuary policies. And actually, one of the things that I think is a really significant accomplishment of you and your leadership is focusing public attention on the impact of sanctuary policies and how they're proliferating and why they're a problem. Do you have a count on sanctuary jurisdictions at ICE?
Yes, and you know, sanctuary jurisdictions is something I'm very strongly opposed to, and of course I've been talking about for a year. But let's talk about secure communities for a minute. Mm-hmm. We're talking about having access of people that have been arrested, right? So for those groups and those representatives say, ICE should concentrate on criminal aliens. You should concentrate on criminals. You should concentrate on criminals. I hear it all the time. Well, we do. But you can't say concentrate on criminals, not let me in a county jail. That's just ridiculous, right? And we're talking about access to people that is state and local law enforcement arrested and locked up. They took their liberty away and put them in a jail cell because they thought they're either a public safety threat or a flight risk. So they already made that choice. Mm-hmm. They're in a county jail. And to be at a point where a federal law enforcement officer, a sworn officer who enforces immigration law, cannot get access to a taxpayer-funded county jail to talk to somebody who's, number one, illegally in the United States, and entering this country illegally is a crime. That's something I've been pushing on you. We've got to remember that. Entering this country is a crime if you enter illegally. And number two, they got arrested for yet another crime. These are exactly the people we should be talking to. Secure communities helped us in that. Yeah, you got those folks that want to say secure communities as, you know, sowing hatred, but it's done quite the opposite. Let me say, as far as sanctuary cities are concerned, you know, the message people want to push is, well, we're a sanctuary city because we're protecting the immigrant community. No, you are not. You're doing quite the opposite. Let me explain why. First of all, sanctuary cities, to be clear, we're not asking anybody to be an immigration officer. We're the immigration officers. I'm not asking you to pull a car over and ask them their immigration status. I don't want you to enforce immigration law. What I want is you to give me access to your county jail where you already chose to arrest somebody and lock them in a jail cell like you would any other federal law enforcement agency. That's what we're asking for. So let's get that clear. We're not asking anybody to be an immigration officer. We're asking you to give access of a sworn federal law enforcement officer to a jail to talk to a criminal that's in the country illegally. To me, that's common sense. But they say sanctuary cities They want to protect the immigrant community. Let me be clear what Sanctuary Cities does. Number one, when you release a criminal alien from a jail, that criminal alien is going to return to his community and victimize the very communities in which he lives, which are immigrant communities. So what you've done in Sanctuary Cities by releasing that criminal alien back into the community is put the immigrant community at greater risk of crime. Number two, my job is to find them and arrest them. That is my job. So if I can't arrest them in the safety and security and privacy of a county jail, safe for everybody, you're going to force my officers to go into the community, knock on the door, puts them at severe risk, because now you're on their turf, where they have access to who knows what weapons. It's dangerous for the alien, it's dangerous for my officers, so you put my officers at great risk. But what you've really done to the immigrant community is, now I'm in the community, and I'm going to find this target of the arrest, and chances are he may be with others that weren't even on my radar. And now they're going to be arrested under executive orders. We don't turn a blind eye anymore. So what has Sanctuary Cities done so far? They put them at greater risk of crime, because the criminal's back in the neighborhood. They put them at greater risk of immigration arrest. And they put my officers at risk. And by pushing this Sanctuary Cities message out there, you are enticing further illegal entry. If they don't think a criminal organization, which I know I've done this for 34 years, these criminal organizations are using Sanctuary Cities as a selling ploy. Look, I'll get you to San Francisco for this much money, and you can even get arrested for committing a crime. They're not going to work with immigration. If Sanctuary Cities are going to see a huge increase of illegal immigration in their cities because they think you're safe, they think immigration, you know, they're not working with immigration, they're safe. They got some sort of amnesty, they got some sort of sanctuary. When they don't, there's no sanctuary from federal law enforcement. The last thing I'll say is by enticing further illegal entry, you are bankrolling criminal organizations, a transnational criminal organization that smuggle aliens in this country. You are smuggling their business. I mean, you are enticing further illegal entry, which is going to profit for their business. You're bankrolling criminal organizations that smuggle guns, that smuggle dope. They don't care what they smuggle. We have many investigations, many intelligence. They smuggle anything for money. So, but these are same criminal organizations that have murdered my agents, that have murdered Border Patrol agents. We're bankrolling criminal organizations with Sanctuary Cities. And the last thing I'll say for anybody that doubts what I'm saying, I dare anybody go into an immigrant community and ask them one simple question. Would you rather have ICE agents working in a county jail or in your neighborhood? What do you think they're going to say? So this whole thing about Sanctuary Cities protecting the immigrant community is just false, it's inaccurate, and it's just politics, putting politics over public safety. That's all it is.
Yeah, this idea, I've studied this for many years. Long
answer, but I'm really emotional about this one.
That's okay. This idea that there is some kind of chilling effect on crime reporting when local law enforcement agencies are cooperating with ICE. I mean, I've studied the academic literature and the government statistics on it, and it is a myth. And anybody who has talked to a local law enforcement officer or an ICE agent will tell you the same thing, that what the immigrants are afraid of is the criminals who are coming back to the community to reoffend.
Well, the whole victim, let me talk about the whole victim thing, because that's, again, intentional mismessaging. When you intentionally mismessage that we arrest people in churches, we arrest people in hospitals, we arrest people in schools, which ICE has not done. We have not arrested anybody in a hospital. We have not arrested anybody in a church. We haven't arrested people on school grounds. So when you constantly push that message, you cause fear in the community. And look, unless a local law enforcement agency is arresting a victim or a witness of a crime, I don't even know they exist. And if I know they exist, there's certain immigration benefits a victim witness can get. So it's just inaccurate information that's pushing this, and you know it's unfortunate, because the reality is that we are focused on the criminals. You look at our numbers last year, 72% of everybody we arrested was a convicted criminal. If you look at criminal history, those that were either convicted or pending criminal charges, 89% of everybody we arrested last year had a criminal history. That's 9 out of 10. That's prioritization. People that say we don't prioritize. And even now they say, well, your non-criminal arrests are way up. But you know, 66% of the non-criminals we got through the criminal justice system, means criminal charges are pending or they've been arrested. So, you know, for that story out there that's saying that we're not prioritizing, we exactly are prioritizing.
And the term non-criminal has a specific meaning in your statistics sense, which is just people who have not been convicted of a crime. And many organizations point to the percentage of non-criminals in the arrest numbers by the time they're removed, are they still non-criminals?
No, many of them are criminals because they've been convicted since, but we got to look at who those non-criminals are. Our priorities are national security, public safety, which are criminals, fugitive re-entrants. So let's talk about it real quick, the non-criminals. Most of them are fugitive re-entrants. Who are they? Re-entrants. These are people that have been formally removed from the country by a judge and re-entered illegally, which is a felony. So that's one piece of the non-criminals. The other piece of non-criminals are fugitives. These are folks who had due process at great taxpayer expense. This country spends billions of dollars a year on border security, immigration court, attorneys, judges. So everybody wants, they deserve due process. You've got to give them due process. Their case needs to be heard, and we'll do that. But once a federal judge makes a decision, our job is to execute that order. And folks that become fugitives ignore the judge's order. If you and I ignore a federal judge's order, what would happen? We'd be arrested and removed. But there's folks out there saying, well, yeah, they've been ordered removed, they've been there 5 years, you shouldn't arrest them. No. If those orders by immigration judge don't mean anything, if they're not executed, then there's no integrity in the entire system. Just open the border up, because there is no penalty. You can violate the laws, have due process at great taxpayer expense, and you get amnesty, you're immune from the law? Absolutely not. There has to be integrity in the system. So we'll give you due process, but just because you don't like the decision of the immigration judge doesn't make it okay to stay here illegally.
Right, right. Well, New York's Governor Cuomo has asked you to cease and desist all enforcement operations in the state of New York. What do you think that would do to public safety?
First of all, it's not going to happen. We're not going to cease and desist doing anything in New York. I'm a native New Yorker.
You're not intimidated by that?
No, I'm not intimidated. But I was born in New York. I was a police officer in New York. My father was a police officer in New York. My grandfather was a police officer in New York. I love New York. I'm a native New Yorker. And we're not going to cease and desist doing what we're doing. If you look at let's tell you one thing we did in New York. And last year we arrested nearly 5,000 criminal aliens off the streets of New York. Nearly 5,000 criminal aliens. So if rather than a cease and desist letter, a letter of thank you would be appreciated. I'm not asking for anybody to cut a slack. But what I'm asking for is a little decency, a little recognition of the 20,000 men and women that work for ICE, that leave the safety and security of their home every day and strap a gun to their hip to defend this nation, defend the communities. A little recognition of that would be nice, rather than a cease and desist letter.
Mm-hmm. Well, another governor, Governor Brown of California, says ICE is lying about all this.
Look, when you look at sanctuary laws in the state of California, the federal government is suing them, which I think is the right thing to do. The California Sheriff's Association, the governor's own sheriffs agree with us that SB 54 prevents communication with ICE, and dangerous criminals like gang members, those that assault police officers, are being released in jails throughout California. So the California Sheriff's Association, his own sheriffs agree SB 54 is damaging. And there's been at least 15 cities and jurisdictions that have joined the lawsuit to sue their very own state. So look, SB 54, Governor Brown's wrong. Any policy that results in the release of a public safety threat back into the public to reoffend, it's just bad policy. Anybody in this room can Google recidivism rates. 50% of these folks will commit another crime the first year of their release.
Just like American criminals.
75% will reoffend within 5 years. So it's to prevent a federal law enforcement officer to take custody of somebody that's in the country illegally and committed a crime, it's just wrong. And so, no, he's wrong. No one's lying about California sanctuary laws. And we'll let the court settle it.
I mean, it seems to me from looking at the numbers that there is no shortage of criminal targets for ICE to be going after. The agency has stated before there are about 2 million estimated criminal aliens in the country, 1 million of whom are at large. You have enough criminal targets that you don't need to be going around arresting grandmothers on their way to church, or college students, or cancer patients, or anything like that.
Well, let me just talk about one thing real quick in that, because something sparked. The biggest hit we take from folks out in some media outlets and groups are, why did you arrest that person that's been here 12 years, has 2 U.S. citizen children? Why did you arrest him? Because he's a fugitive. If the message we want to keep sending the rest of the world is, it's okay to violate laws of this country, even though we're a sovereign country. You can go ahead and enter this country illegally and hide out successfully, or just ignore a judge's order and have a U.S. citizen child by the fact they're born in this country. If that's the message we want to send, enter the country illegally, hide, and have a child, Now you're immune from law enforcement. If that's a message we want to send the rest of this world, you're never going to solve the immigration crisis because they're going to keep coming, right? So the laws are on the books. We need to enforce the laws. And I'm one to say Congress needs to look at the immigration laws. There needs to be some reforms, some fixes. But ignoring the law isn't the answer. Just because you enter the country legally or successfully hit out for a while doesn't make it okay.
When someone is released, a criminal alien released out from under an ICE detainer, or because local law enforcement agency didn't contact ICE, or because they have a policy of non-cooperation, or ICE isn't allowed in the jail, a lot of law enforcement agencies will say, well, ICE can go get these people anytime. They know where they are. Can you explain why that's not so easy?
Well, first of all, once they get released, they're hard to find, right? First of all, what we do is just make it clear, targeted enforcement operation. We don't go in the neighborhood to do sweeps, as you read in the paper, some papers. We don't do sweeps, we don't do raids. We do targeted enforcement operation, which means we go look for a specific person at a specific location based on a lot of intelligence and criminal investigative work. We know who we're going to look for, and we know hopefully where they're going to be. So we're not locking down a neighborhood. We're not doing roadblocks. So it's difficult. It creates a lot of work, first of all, in the targeting and the intelligence investigative work, try to locate this person, because they don't want to be found, right? They're in the country illegally, and they commit, and if they're a criminal, they're more likely they don't want to be found. So it's a lot of work. But what it does is put my officers at great risk. You know, when we arrest somebody in a county jail, we know they don't have weapons. The officer is safe, the alien's saved, the neighborhood's safe, but when you release them, we gotta go find them. And that is, you know, I got a lot of attacks when California passed the Sanctuary Cities law. I made a statement, California better hold on tight because they're about to see a lot more agents than they've ever seen. That is a fact. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't retaliation. When one officer can sit in a county jail and process 10 illegal aliens in a shift, now you release that those 10 aliens to the street, I got to send a whole team out to try to locate one. So when I said you're about to see a lot more agents, that is a direct result of SB 54 because I've lost my efficiency of being in a county jail where one agent can deal with 10. Now I got to send a whole fugitive operations team, which is 5 to 6 guys, to go look for one. So that's why there was a surge in resources in California, because you just made my job a lot more difficult and I lost the efficiency. That was the message.
Mm-hmm. With the exact kind of enforcement that the advocacy groups say that they're opposed to in the neighborhoods and work.
More officers, simple math, more officers in the county jail equals less officers in the community. That's just operational reality. So again, if people want me to focus on criminal aliens, which we're doing, I just explained to you 9 out of 10, right? But if I can do more if I have access to a county jail. Mm-hmm. So don't tell me to prioritize criminals, but you can't come to my county jail. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, now then there are these law enforcement agencies, and actually mostly the ACLU and their allies that will say, well, look, we should have law enforcement agencies cooperate, but you know, why can't you just provide a judicial warrant? Why can't you just get a criminal warrant if you want us to hold somebody for you?
Because there is no law that dictates that. When Congress passed the Immigration Nationality Act, there is no process in place to get a judicial warrant. It's an administrative process. The law is clear. So there is no mechanism in place to get a judicial warrant. The law doesn't require a judicial warrant. I mean,
who could issue a judicial warrant?
It'd have to be a magistrate, but...
Do they have that authority?
No, they don't have the authority. So that's what, again, you don't hear, right? They don't have the authority to issue a judicial warrant, a criminal judicial warrant for administrative immigration law violation. It doesn't exist.
It's a red herring, in other words.
Yes,
is that what you're
absolutely. Saying? And we got to remember something. The detainers, a lot of the litigation, the detainers, well, we don't find it constitutional. Well, the Fifth Circuit just said they were, right? So we have courts that say they're constitutional. And what the detainer has changed in the last several years, the new detainer, there is a statement of probable cause within that detainer. We have probable cause that person's in the United States illegally based on our investigation. Probable cause standards is new to the detainer in the last couple of years, so that's where it's changed. And let's talk about detainers for a minute. Even if you choose not to honor a detainer because your attorney general or your county attorney says, oh, we think they're illegal. If you read the detainer, they have an option on that detainer. Hold them for 48 hours until we can come get them, or notify us before you release them. So there is no liability to say, we're going to contact ICE before we release the person on our charges. Don't hold them a minute past you would normally hold them. just let us know before you release them on your charges. That's an option. And a lot of sheriffs take that option because a lot of sheriffs want to work with us despite the court controversy on detainers. They chose the option, we're going to notify ICE before we release them on our charges, and we'll be there to take custody of them.
All right. Well, let's change to another subject now, to one that's been in the news a lot in the last couple weeks, about the influx of people arriving illegally from Central America, both families and kids. There have been, since 2014, more than 300,000